Dear friends, after a tiring and stressful day, welcome to Mysterious Sleep Stories, a sanctuary of mysterious, historical, and inexplicable events. Tonight, together, we journey into the shadows of America's past, to places where magnificent Victoria hotels still stand as monuments to both human ambition and spirits that refuse to leave. Tonight, we go deep into the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, to a place where healing waters once promised miracles, where a magnificent hotel soared to the clouds, and where a charlatan in a white suit performed unspeakable acts that would forever echo. This is the story of the Crescent Hotel and the doctor who never left. So settle into your pillows, forget the outside world, and let me transport you to 1886, a time when hope and terror walked the same corridors, and the line between life and death was terrifyingly thin. The birth of Eureka Springs, where waters promised miracles. Long before the first European settlers ever gazed upon the rugged beauty of the Ozark Mountains, the indigenous peoples of this land knew of a sacred place. Deep in the hills of what would one day become northwest Arkansas, where the ancient limestone carved valleys and the forest grew thick with oak and hickory, there existed springs that were different from all others. The Osage, the Delaware, and the Shawnee tribes all spoke of these waters in hushed, reverent tones. They called this place sacred ground, a gift from the Great Spirit, where the earth itself seemed to possess a healing touch. Legends passed down through countless generations told of a great healing spring hidden among these mountains, a place where the sick could be made whole, where the blind could see, and where ailments that plagued the human body simply melted away like morning mist under the rising sun. The springs themselves were cold, crystal clear, bubbling up from deep within the limestone bedrock that formed the bones of the Ozarks. There are not just one or two of these springs, but dozens, each with its own character, its own mineral composition, its own particular gift. The water tasted clean and pure, carrying with it the essence of the ancient stone through which it had traveled for millennia. These are not hot springs like those found further south in Arkansas at Hot Springs. These were cold springs, their temperature constant year-round, never varying more than a few degrees regardless of the season. The indigenous peoples understood that there was something special about these waters, something that went beyond mere refreshment. They would make pilgrimages to these springs, traveling from far away to fill their vessels and carry the precious liquid back to their villages. Warriors would bathe their wounds in the springs. Mothers would bring their sick children. The elderly would drink deeply, hoping to push back the advance of years. And often, remarkably often, they found relief. When Hernando de Soto and his expedition pushed through this region around 1541, they may have encountered these springs, though no definitive record survived to confirm it. The Spanish conquistadors were searching for gold, for cities of wealth, for anything that might justify their brutal march through the wilderness. They found none of what they sought in these mountains. Had they taken the time to investigate the springs, had they understood what the native peoples already knew, they might have discovered something far more valuable than gold. But they passed through, leaving only speculation and possibility in their wake. The springs remained, as they had for thousands of years, waiting for someone who would recognize their value. That recognition would not come for more than 3 centuries after de Soto's expedition. The person who would bring these springs into the American consciousness was a man named Dr. Alva Jackson. Now, It's important to understand that Dr. Jackson was a product of his time, the mid-19th century, when the line between legitimate medicine and what we might today call quackery was often blurry at best. Medical knowledge was still primitive by modern standards. The germ theory of disease was not yet widely accepted. Doctors often did more harm than good with their bloodletting and their mercury treatments. In this context, the idea that natural spring water might possess healing properties was not considered particularly outlandish. After all, people have been visiting spa towns in Europe for centuries, seeking relief from all manner of ailments in mineral waters. Dr. Jackson's own story of discovering the healing properties of Basin Spring has become the founding myth of Eureka Springs, told and retold with variations that have blurred the line between history and legend. The most common version goes something like this. In 1856, Dr. Jackson was out in the wilderness, tracking a wounded hunting dog through the dense Ozark forest. The terrain here is unforgiving, all steep hills and rocky outcroppings, thick underbrush that catches at your clothes and makes every step a challenge. As he pushed deeper into the woods, he heard the sound of water, a gentle trickling that drew him toward a small clearing. There, he found his dog drinking from a spring that emerged from between moss-covered rocks. The water formed a natural basin in the smooth stone before overflowing and continuing downhill in a tiny creek. Jackson's son had been suffering from a chronic eye condition, one that had resisted all conventional treatments of the day. The boy's eyes were constantly inflamed, weeping, causing him pain and threatening his vision. In desperation, and perhaps inspired by the old folk wisdom about natural remedies, Dr. Jackson took some of the spring water home and had his son bathe his eyes with it. Whether through the properties of the water itself, the power of belief, or simple coincidence, the boy's condition improved dramatically. His eyes cleared. The inflammation subsided. He could see clearly again without pain. Dr. Jackson, convinced that he had found something extraordinary, began to investigate further. He returned to the spring and began to clear away the accumulated gravel and mud that had built up around it over the years. As he dug deeper, he discovered that the water emerged from a perfectly smooth stone basin, carved by nature itself over countless ages. This discovery seemed to confirm his belief that this was no ordinary spring. He named it Basin Spring, and he began to tell others about its miraculous properties. Word spread slowly at first, just local farmers and their families coming to try the water for themselves. Some reported cures for ailments ranging from skin conditions to digestive problems to rheumatism. Dr. Jackson, ever the entrepreneur, began bottling and selling the water under the name Dr. Jackson's Eye Water. He made modest claims at first, marketing it primarily for eye ailments like the one that had afflicted his son. During the Civil War, the Ozark region found itself caught between North and South, with irregular fighting and guerrilla warfare, making life dangerous and unpredictable. Dr. Jackson, according to local legend, established a hospital in a local cave, using the spring water to treat wounded soldiers from both sides of the conflict. The cave would have provided natural shelter and a relatively stable temperature year-round, important considerations for caring for the wounded. Whether his treatments were actually effective or whether the soldiers simply healed naturally over time is impossible to say with certainty now, but the stories of miraculous recoveries persisted. After the war ended, Jackson continued his business, but he remained relatively quiet about the exact location of his springs, sharing the water mainly with locals and those who specifically sought him out. This relative obscurity might have continued indefinitely had it not been for one man's desperate search for healing and the friendship that brought him to Basin Spring. In the spring of 1879, a man named Judge Levi Bess Saunders was suffering terribly from a condition called erysipelas, a bacterial skin infection that causes severe inflammation, pain, and spreading red patches across the skin. In an era before antibiotics, erysipelas could be deadly, and it was certainly agonizing. Judge Saunders, a respected figure from Berryville, Arkansas, had tried every treatment available to 19th century medicine. Nothing worked. The infection continued to spread, the inflammation worsened, and Saunders found himself facing the possibility that this affliction might kill him, or at the very least, leave him permanently disfigured and disabled. In May of 1879, Dr. Jackson, who was a friend and hunting companion of Judge Saunders, suggested that the judge come and try the waters of Basin Spring as a last resort. Saunders, having exhausted all other options, made the difficult journey into the Ozark wilderness. Remember, there are no paved roads, no easy access to this remote location. Getting there required determination and no small amount of physical hardship. When Saunders arrived, he found a primitive camp, just a few rough shelters near the spring. The location was beautiful in its wild state, all steep hillsides covered in trees, with the spring emerging from the rocky terrain, its cold, clear water flowing steadily regardless of drought or rain. Saunders began to apply the water to his afflicted skin and to drink it, as Dr. Jackson recommended. Whether through the mineral content of the water, the belief in its healing power, or pure chance, Judge Saunders experienced what he could only describe as a miracle. Over the course of days, and then weeks, his symptoms began to improve. The angry red inflammation began to fade. The pain lessened. The infection, which had resisted every other treatment, seemed to retreat before the power of Basin Spring water. Saunders, overwhelmed with gratitude and convinced that he had experienced genuine healing, decided that this discovery was too important to keep quiet. If these waters had cured him of a condition that had nearly killed him, then surely others deserved to know about this place. Surely there were countless people suffering from ailments that might be helped by these springs. Judge Saunders began to spread the word with evangelical fervor. He told everyone he knew about his experience. He wrote letters to friends and family throughout Arkansas and neighboring states. He spoke at public gatherings, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. In an age when medicine could do relatively little for chronic conditions, when pain and suffering were accepted as inevitable parts of life, the promise of natural healing was incredibly attractive. People began to arrive at Basin Spring, first in small numbers, then in increasingly large groups. They came on horseback and in wagons, traveling for days or even weeks to reach this remote location. They arrived suffering from arthritis, skin diseases, digestive problems, blindness, deafness, paralysis, and 100 other ailments. They came hoping for miracles, and many of them claimed to find exactly that. By late 1879, the area around Basin Spring had transformed from an isolated wilderness to a boomtown unlike anything Arkansas had seen before. Within a matter of months, the population exploded from virtually zero to an estimated 10,000 people. Think about that for a moment. 10,000 people in a place where there had been nothing but forest just months before. They erected tents and built hasty shanties out of rough-cut lumber. The hillsides, which were so steep that building was a challenge, became covered with temporary structures climbing up the slopes in every direction. People lived in conditions that would shock modern sensibilities. There was no infrastructure, no sewage system, no organized streets, no real law enforcement. It was pure chaos, but it was chaos driven by hope and the desperate human desire for healing. On July 4th, 1879, this ramshackle collection of tents and shanties was officially founded as a city. The name chosen was perfect in its simplicity and meaning. Eureka, from the Greek word meaning "I have found it," combined with springs to create Eureka Springs. The name was reportedly suggested by Burton Buck Saunders, the son of Judge Saunders, and it perfectly captured the spirit of discovery and hope that animated everyone who came to this place. They had found it. They had found the healing they sought, or at least the possibility of healing, and that was enough to transform a wilderness into a city almost overnight. The growth of Eureka Springs was so rapid and so dramatic that it caught the attention of people who saw not just healing potential, but commercial opportunity. By 1880, just 1 year after its founding, Eureka Springs was incorporated as an official city. By 1881, it had become Arkansas's fourth largest city, behind only Little Rock, Fort Smith, and Pine Bluff. By 1889, it would reach its peak as the state's second largest city, surpassed only by the capital. This kind of growth was unprecedented in Arkansas history. Nothing like it had happened before, and nothing like it would happen again. The springs themselves were the heart of everything. Visitors would discover that there were not just 1 or 2 springs in the area, but more than 60 within what would become the city limits. Each spring was given a name, often based on its perceived properties or the person who first popularized it. There was Sweet Spring, Arsenic Spring, Lithia Spring, Harding Spring, and dozens of others. People would move from spring to spring, sampling the different waters, hoping to find the particular combination of minerals that would address their specific ailment. Elaborate rock work and wooden structures were built around the springs to make them more accessible and to beautify them. By the 1880s and 1890s, you could walk from spring to spring on wooden sidewalks and stairs, each location marked with signs proclaiming its particular healing virtues. The water from these springs was indeed different from ordinary well water or river water. Analysis showed varying concentrations of different minerals depending on which spring you sampled. Calcium, magnesium, iron, and other elements could be found in different proportions. Whether these mineral contents were responsible for the cures that people reported is a matter of debate even today. Modern medicine would say that most of the reported cures were likely due to the placebo effect, to natural healing that would have occurred anyway, or to misdiagnosis of the original conditions. But the people of the 1880s had no reason to doubt their experiences. They came sick, they drank the water or bathed in it, and they felt better. For them, that was evidence enough. The economy of Eureka Springs developed entirely around the springs and the thousands of visitors they attracted. Hotels began to spring up, some small and modest, others increasingly grand as investors recognized the potential for profit. Bathhouses were constructed where visitors could immerse themselves in the spring water in privacy and comfort. Restaurants, saloons, dry goods stores, groceries, and livery stables all appear to serve the needs of the health seekers and tourists. The town climbed the hillsides in every direction, with buildings perched on terraces cut into the steep slopes, connected by a maze of winding streets that went up and down and around in ways that seemed to defy logic. It became known as the stair-step town because there were so many flights of stairs connecting different levels, so many paths that climbed straight up or descended straight down. But the most ambitious development was yet to come. In 1882, a group of investors led by former Arkansas Governor Powell Clayton formed the Eureka Springs Improvement Company. Clayton was a controversial figure, a carpetbagger who had come south after the Civil War and had involved himself in Arkansas politics during Reconstruction. Whatever one might think of his political career, there was no denying his vision for Eureka Springs and his connections to money and power. The improvement company had two major goals that would transform Eureka Springs from a health resort into one of the premier destinations in the American South. First, they needed to bring the railroad to Eureka Springs. In 1880, the nearest railroad terminal was in Pierce City, Missouri, a brutal 55 miles away over rough roads. Visitors had to endure a 9-hour coach ride to complete their journey, arriving exhausted and jostled from the terrible roads. In 1881, the St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad, known as the Frisco, reached Seligman, Missouri, cutting the distance to a more manageable 20 miles, but that was still inadequate for the improvement company's ambitions. They wanted direct rail service, and through their connections and capital, they managed to make it happen. In 1882, the Eureka Springs Railroad was completed, bringing direct service from the Frisco line into the heart of the city. Suddenly, people from St. Louis, Chicago, New Orleans, and beyond could reach Eureka Springs in relative comfort and speed. The floodgates opened even wider. The second major goal of the improvement company was even more ambitious. They wanted to build a hotel that would rival anything in America, a grand resort that would attract not just the sick and desperate, but the wealthy and fashionable. They wanted to transform Eureka Springs from a rough health resort into a destination for high society, a place where the rich could come not just to take the waters, but to be seen, to enjoy luxury and elegance while they pursued their health. Governor Clayton used his connections to investors in St. Louis and beyond to raise the necessary capital. The company purchased 15 acres on the crest of West Mountain, high above the town, with commanding views in every direction. The location was perfect, a prominence that would allow the hotel to be seen for miles and would give guests breathtaking vistas of the Ozark Mountains stretching away into the blue distance. The improvement company brought in Isaac L. Taylor, a noted architect from Missouri who had already made a name for himself designing significant buildings. Taylor's vision for the Crescent Hotel, as it would be called, was nothing short of spectacular. This would be no simple building, but a grand Victorian showpiece that would incorporate multiple architectural styles into a cohesive whole. The design called for massive limestone blocks, walls 18 inches thick, multiple towers and turrets, overhanging balconies, ornate woodwork, and a grand lobby with a fireplace, so large you could practically walk into it. The hotel would have 72 guest rooms, each with its own character and charm. There would be fine dining, elegant public rooms, wide verandas where guests could take the mountain air, and every modern convenience that 1880s technology could provide. Construction began in 1884, and the work was massive in scope. The improvement company brought in skilled Irish stonemasons to handle the limestone work. These were craftsmen who had learned their trade in the old country, men who understood how to work stone, how to shape it and fit it so precisely that mortar became almost unnecessary, how to create structures that would stand for centuries. The stone itself came from local quarries, the pale gray limestone that forms the bones of the Ozarks, cut into massive blocks that had to be hauled up the mountain by teams of horses and positioned by human muscle and simple mechanical advantage. There were no powered cranes, no modern equipment. Everything was done by hand, by sweat, by the skill and determination of workers who understood that they were building something that would last. The construction site would have been a scene of incredible activity and danger. Men working high above the ground on scaffolding that would make modern safety inspectors blanch. The sound of hammers on stone, the shouts of foremen, the creaking of ropes and pulleys as massive blocks were hoisted into place. Sawdust and stone dust filling the air. The smell of sweat and horses, of fresh-cut lumber and wet mortar. It was hard, dangerous work, and in an era before workplace safety regulations, accidents were not uncommon. Men fell. Men were crushed. Men died building great structures, and usually their names were forgotten. Just another anonymous worker whose sacrifice was subsumed into the grand vision of the architects and owners. But one of these workers would not be forgotten. His name, or at least the name that history has given him, was Michael, and he was 17 years old. The story of what happened to Michael has become one of the founding legends of the Crescent Hotel, repeated by tour guides and ghost hunters, embellished and elaborated over the years, but based on a real tragedy that occurred during the construction. Michael was one of the Irish stonemasons, young and strong, with red hair and, according to the stories, a flirtatious nature that made him popular with the young women who would come to watch the construction. The story goes that one day, Michael was working on the roof, high above the ground, setting stones for one of the upper sections of the building. A young woman walked into the garden area below, and Michael, ever the charmer, leaned out to call down to her, to catch her attention, to say something witty or flattering. He leaned too far. The fall was not immediate to the ground. Michael struck a beam, a massive timber that would become part of the internal structure of what would eventually be designated as Room 218. The impact killed him instantly, his young life snuffed out in a moment of carelessness, of human error, of the kind of random tragedy that has claimed countless construction workers throughout history. His body was found, broken and still, in the space that would later house guests who came seeking nothing more than a pleasant stay at a grand hotel. The other workers, his fellow Irishmen, would have mourned him in their own way, perhaps saying prayers in the old language, perhaps drinking to his memory when the workday ended. Then they went back to work because the construction had to continue, because their own livelihoods depended on completing this massive project. Michael's death was recorded, probably in some dusty ledger that has long since crumbled or been lost. Just another line of text noting the death of a laborer. The hotel rose higher. By 1886, 2 years after construction began, the Crescent Hotel was complete. The result was breathtaking. The building seemed to grow out of the mountaintop, its pale limestone walls glowing in the sun, its towers reaching toward the sky, its wraparound verandas offering views that stretched for miles across the Ozark Hills. You could stand on those verandas and feel like you were on top of the world, with nothing but forest and mountain ridges rolling away to the horizon in every direction. The entrance featured a porte cochere where carriages could pull up to discharge passengers under cover. The lobby was grand and airy, with high ceilings supported by massive columns, dark wood paneling, and that enormous fireplace that would take logs 4 or 5 feet long. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting prismatic light throughout the space. The grand staircase swept upward, inviting guests to their rooms on the upper floors. The official grand opening took place on May 20th, 1886, and it was an event unlike anything Arkansas had seen. The Daily Arkansas Gazette called it a grander occasion than the holiday festivities, with the formal opening of the Crescent Hotel in this city has not been witnessed in Arkansas. Visitors came from at least 6 states for the celebration. A special excursion train brought guests from Springfield, Missouri, met by bands, uniformed orders, and a parade of carriages that escorted them up the winding road to the hotel. More than 600 people sat down to what was described as a Delmonico dinner, referring to the famous New York restaurant that represented the height of sophisticated dining. That night, the entire hotel was illuminated from basement to garret, every window glowing, the building visible for miles as a beacon of elegance and prosperity. In the grand dining room, elegantly dressed ladies and gentlemen danced to excellent music, the men in their formal black suits, the women in their finest gowns with bustles and elaborate hairstyles, their jewelry catching the light from the chandeliers as they whirled across the polished floor. The Eureka Springs Times-Echo proclaimed the Crescent America's most luxurious resort hotel, and for once, the local paper was not exaggerating. This was luxury on a scale that most Arkansans had never experienced. Each guest room was appointed with fine furniture, thick carpets, and attention to detail that spoke of quality and permanence. The dining room served multiple courses prepared by trained chefs. The service was attentive and professional. Guests could take the waters at the various springs in town, then return to the Crescent to relax in comfort and style. They could sit on the verandas and breathe the pure mountain air that was believed to have therapeutic properties all its own. They could stroll the manicured grounds, take carriage rides through the surrounding countryside, or simply enjoy the company of other refined people in the elegant public rooms. For several years, the Crescent Hotel was exactly what its creators had envisioned: a destination for the wealthy and fashionable, a place where society gathered, where reputations could be made or unmade, where the romance of the Victorian era was on full display. But nothing remains static forever. The same forces that had created Eureka Springs' explosive growth would eventually lead to its decline. The faith in the healing powers of mineral waters, which had seemed so certain in the 1880s, began to wane as the 20th century approached and medical science advanced. People began to place more trust in doctors and hospitals than in natural springs. The development of effective medicines and surgical techniques made the old spa treatments seem quaint and outdated. Why travel hundreds of miles to drink spring water when a doctor could prescribe actual medication that had been proven effective? The decline was gradual at first. Fewer visitors came to Eureka Springs each year. The hotels that had sprung up so quickly found themselves competing for a shrinking pool of guests. Some closed. Others reduced their rates and their services, trying to hang on in an increasingly difficult market. The Crescent Hotel, despite its grandeur, was not immune to these economic forces. By 1908, just 22 years after its grand opening, the hotel could no longer sustain itself as a resort destination. The improvement company had to find another use for the building or risk losing their massive investment to abandonment and decay. The solution they found was to transform the Crescent Hotel into an educational institution. In 1908, the building reopened as the Crescent College and Conservatory for young women. This was to be one of the most exclusive boarding schools in Arkansas, a place where wealthy families could send their daughters to receive an education befitting young ladies of society. The curriculum included not just academic subjects, but music, art, deportment, all the accomplishments that were considered essential for young women of the upper classes in the early 20th century. The hotel's guest rooms became dormitory rooms. The dining room continued its function, now serving not wealthy tourists but young students. The grand public rooms became classrooms and practice spaces where young women learned piano and voice, where they studied literature and history, where they prepared themselves for their future roles as wives and mothers in respectable society. The transformation was not total, however. The school operated on a traditional academic calendar, which meant that it was closed during the summer months. During those summers, the Crescent would revert to its original function as a hotel, welcoming guests who still believed in the healing waters or who simply wanted to enjoy the beauty of the Ozarks and the elegance of the Victorian-era building. This dual purpose allowed the building to remain financially viable, at least for a time. But the educational mission would bring its own tragedies to the Crescent, adding more layers to the growing collection of sorrows that seemed to accumulate within those thick limestone walls. During the years that the Crescent operated as a school, from 1908 to 1924, hundreds of young women passed through its doors. They formed friendships, studied their lessons, practiced their music, and dreamed about their futures. For most of them, these were happy years, or at least years that they would remember fondly as they grew older. But not all of their stories ended happily. One young woman, whose name has been lost to history or perhaps deliberately forgotten, met with tragedy during her time at the school. The exact details vary depending on who tells the story, but the basic facts are consistent. She fell from a balcony on the 4th floor, plummeting down through the open space of the stairwell to the basement level far below. Whether she jumped, whether she was pushed, whether it was a terrible accident, no one can say with certainty now. The records are sparse or non-existent. What is known is that she died, that her young life ended violently in a building that was supposed to be a place of learning and growth, and that her death added another ghost to the Crescent's growing collection. Then there was the dean's son, a small boy named Clifton Breckenridge Thompson, though everyone called him Brecky. He was about 4 years old, full of energy and life, as small boys are, probably a handful for his parents as he ran through the hallways and explored every corner of the great building. In those days, appendicitis was often a death sentence, especially for small children. When the appendix becomes inflamed and bursts, releasing infection into the abdominal cavity, there is little time to act, and in an era before antibiotics, even immediate surgery often failed to save the patient. Little Brecky developed appendicitis while living at the Crescent. Despite whatever medical attention he received, he died there, in one of the rooms that had once hosted wealthy tourists and now housed students and staff. His parents must have been devastated, carrying their small son's body away from the place where they had lived, where they had tried to build a life. But something of Brecky, the stories say, chose to stay. The Crescent College and Conservatory for Young Women struggled financially throughout its existence. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, dealt the final blow to many marginal institutions, and the school was no exception. By 1924, it could no longer sustain itself. The doors closed, the students were sent home, and the Crescent Hotel stood empty once again. It would reopen briefly in 1930 as Crescent Junior College, offering a less expensive 2-year program, but that venture too would fail, closing permanently in 1934. The building, that grand monument to Victorian optimism and architectural ambition, sat silent and dark, its windows staring out over Eureka Springs like empty eyes, its hallways echoing with nothing but the ghosts of all who had passed through over the decades. And then, in 1937, Norman Baker came to town. He came with money, with charm, with promises of restoration and prosperity. He came with a vision that would transform the Crescent Hotel once again, but this time into something dark, something that would leave scars far deeper than any that had come before. Norman Baker would turn the Crescent into a house of horrors masquerading as a house of healing. And in doing so, he would ensure that his own spirit would be forever tied to the building, unable to rest, unable to escape the consequences of the evil he perpetrated within those thick limestone walls. But before we delve into the darkness of Norman Baker's reign, let's pause for a moment and appreciate what the Crescent Hotel represented in those early years. It was a symbol of hope, a monument to human ambition, a testament to the belief that we could build something beautiful and lasting, something that would serve noble purposes and bring joy to those who entered its doors. The Irish stonemasons who cut and placed each massive block, who gave their sweat and sometimes their lives to the construction, they were creating something they believed would stand for centuries, would outlast them and their children and their children's children. And they were right. The Crescent Hotel still stands, still dominates the skyline of Eureka Springs, still draws visitors from around the world. But it draws them now not for healing waters or refined society or educational opportunities. It draws them because of the darkness that came later, because of the suffering and death that accumulated within those walls, because of the spirits that refused to leave. The Grand Hotel that was meant to represent the best of the Victorian age has become known instead as America's most haunted hotel, a destination for those who seek not healing, but the thrill of encountering the supernatural. In those quiet years after the school closed, when the building stood empty and waiting, the ghosts that already inhabited it must have wandered the silent halls, unobserved by living eyes. Michael, the young stonemason, probably still haunted the area around room 218, perhaps confused about why he could not seem to leave, perhaps angry at the life cut short, perhaps simply tied to the place where his last moments of pain and terror had occurred. The young woman who fell from the balcony might have drifted through the stairwell, eternally falling in a loop of remembered trauma. Little Brecky, too young to understand death, might have continued his explorations, looking for his parents, wondering why the building had become so quiet, why no one would play with him anymore. Dr. Ellis, who had served as the hotel's physician during its early years, and who would later be buried in the local cemetery with a stone that noted his service to the Crescent, perhaps returned to walk the halls he had known so well in life, his spirit drawn back to the place where he had practiced his profession. These spirits, these echoes of the past, had the building largely to themselves during those years of abandonment. But they would soon have company, far more company than they might have wished for, as Norman Baker transformed the Crescent into his cancer hospital, and dozens of desperate, dying patients came through those doors seeking a cure that would never come. The arrival of Norman Baker. A showman becomes a monster. Norman Glenwood Baker was born on November 27th, 1882, in Muscatine, Iowa, a small Mississippi River town where his family enjoyed a certain level of prominence. His father, John Baker, was an inventor who reportedly held 126 patents over the course of his life. His mother, Frances Mary Schultz, had been a writer before her marriage. Norman was the 10th and last child in this family, and he grew up in an environment where invention and self-promotion were valued skills. From his earliest years, Norman showed a talent for performance and persuasion. He was intelligent, charismatic, and possessed of an outsized confidence that would serve him well in his various ventures throughout his life. But he also possessed something darker, an absolute lack of moral scruples when it came to separating people from their money. After leaving high school during his sophomore year, Baker worked as what was called a tram machinist, traveling from town to town, taking temporary work wherever he could find it. But this was not a life that satisfied his ambitions. He wanted more, wanted to be someone important, someone wealthy, someone that people would remember. His entry into show business came after he witnessed a vaudeville magician perform. Baker was captivated not by the magic itself, but by the audience's reaction to it, by the way a clever performer could control a crowd, could make them believe anything, could reach into their pockets and extract their money while they smiled and applauded. He organized his own traveling vaudeville troupe, with himself as the star and manager. The centerpiece of his act was a character called Madame Pearl Tangley, a mind reader who supposedly could tell audience members their deepest secrets and predict their futures. Of course, it was all trickery and cold reading, the standard techniques that fake psychics have used for centuries, but Baker was good at it. He even reportedly married one of the women who played Madame Pearl Tangley, though that marriage ended in annulment, perhaps because she discovered that the man behind the showman's mask was not the person she thought she was marrying. But vaudeville was ultimately just a stepping stone for Baker. He had bigger dreams, grander schemes. In the 1920s, radio was the new frontier of mass communication, and Baker recognized its potential immediately. In 1925, he founded radio station KTNT in Muscatine, with the call letters standing for Know the Naked Truth. This motto would become Baker's brand, his claim that he was telling people the truths that others wanted to hide, that he was exposing the lies and conspiracies of the establishment. The station was sponsored initially by the Muscatine Chamber of Commerce and focused on rural and small-town issues. Baker proved to be a natural on the radio. His voice was compelling, his speaking style dramatic and engaging. He knew how to work an audience, how to build suspense, how to make people hang on every word. It didn't take long for Baker's true nature to emerge. He began to use his radio platform to attack targets that resonated with certain segments of his audience. He railed against the American Medical Association, calling doctors educated fools and cutters, claiming that they were more interested in making money than in healing patients. He suggested that the letters MD stood for more dough. He attacked aluminum pots and pans, claiming they poisoned food. He spoke out against fluoridation of water, against vaccinations, against bovine tuberculosis testing. These positions weren't based on science or evidence. They were based on whatever would get Baker attention and build his audience. And it worked. People loved the drama, loved feeling like they were in on secret knowledge that the establishment didn't want them to have. Baker's radio show became immensely popular, broadcast across the nation, reaching hundreds of thousands of listeners. But Baker wasn't content with just being a radio personality. He wanted to sell products, to translate his popularity into wealth. Around 1930, he learned about a man named Charles Ozias of Kansas City who claimed to have developed a cure for cancer. Now, it's important to understand the context of this era. Cancer was a terrifying diagnosis, essentially a death sentence. Conventional medicine could offer surgery, which often didn't work and left patients disfigured and in agony. Radiation treatment with radium was beginning to be used, but it frequently caused severe burns and other complications. Many cancer patients suffered terribly before they died, and the thought of finding a gentler, more natural cure was incredibly appealing. Baker tested Ozarks' supposed cure on 5 subjects. All 5 died quickly. A rational person might have concluded that the cure didn't work. Baker concluded that he had found a business opportunity. He brought the convicted medical swindler Harry Hoxsey to Muscatine and began promoting his own cancer cure, claiming it was based on Ozarks' formula. What was in this miracle cure? The ingredients varied over time, but typically included common substances like corn silk, watermelon seeds, clover, water, and carbolic acid, which is better known as phenol and is actually poisonous in concentrated form. There is nothing in this mixture that could possibly cure cancer or any other serious disease. It was, in modern terminology, snake oil, a worthless concoction sold to desperate people at exorbitant prices. Baker opened the Baker Institute in Muscatine in April 1930 and began advertising his cancer cure on his radio station. The advertisements were brazen and unscrupulous. Baker claimed he could cure not just cancer, but virtually any disease. He said his treatments were painless, unlike the surgery and radiation offered by legitimate doctors. He charged enormous sums, often thousands of dollars per patient, fortunes in Depression-era money that desperate people somehow scraped together in the hope of saving their own lives or the lives of loved ones. Patients came from across the country, drawn by Baker's radio broadcasts, by his confident claims, by the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this charismatic man had discovered something that the medical establishment had missed. But the medical establishment was not amused. The Journal of the American Medical Association published an editorial accusing Baker of quackery, which was absolutely correct. The Federal Radio Commission, under pressure from the AMA and legitimate doctors who were horrified by what Baker was doing, moved to shut down KTNT. They revoked Baker's radio license in 1931, claiming that he was broadcasting false and misleading medical information. The station went silent, at least in the United States. Baker's hospital business declined without his ability to advertise on the radio, and he faced increasing scrutiny from authorities. Baker's response to this setback was characteristic of the man's audacity and his complete lack of respect for the law. He sued the AMA for calling him a quack, a faker, and a charlatan, even though those descriptions were entirely accurate. The lawsuit went nowhere. More importantly, Baker looked for a way around the radio license problem. He found his solution in Mexico. Just across the border from the United States, Mexican authorities were willing to grant broadcasting licenses to stations that American authorities would never approve. These stations, called border blasters, used incredibly powerful transmitters to broadcast into the United States, beyond the reach of American regulators. John Brinkley, another notorious quack who transplanted goat glands into male patients claiming it would restore their virility and cure various ailments, had already established Station XCR at Villa Acuna, opposite Del Rio, Texas. Baker decided to follow Brinkley's example. He established XCNT at Nuevo Laredo, just across the border from Laredo, Texas, with a 100,000-watt transmitter that could be heard across most of North America. This was one of the most powerful radio stations in the world at that time. Its signal reached into Canada, throughout the United States, and deep into Mexico. XCNT became Baker's new platform for promoting his cancer cures and for airing his increasingly extreme views. He continued his attacks on the medical establishment, but his targets expanded. He began to broadcast anti-Semitic content, blaming Jews for various conspiracies and problems. He attacked Catholics with similar venom. These weren't just political opinions. They were expressions of a deep paranoia and hatred that revealed the darkness at the core of Norman Baker's personality. He was also reported to broadcast live while engaging in sexual acts with his mistresses, an outrageous violation of decency even by the loose standards of border radio. His programming was an eclectic and often disturbing mix of hillbilly music, medical quackery, hate speech, and sensationalism, all designed to shock and attract attention. In 1936, Baker made a foray into politics, running for the United States Senate from Iowa. His campaign was based on the same populist appeals that had made his radio show successful, attacking established institutions, claiming to speak for the common man against elites and conspiracies. He lost badly, failing to gain any significant support. The same year, a ghost-written biography appeared titled Doctors, Dynamiters, and Gunmen: The Life Story of Norman Baker. The book was pure hagiography, presenting Baker as a heroic crusader against the forces of darkness and corruption. The subtitle called it the most important book ever written, a claim so grandiose that it bordered on parody. But for Baker's true believers, those who listened to his radio broadcasts and trusted his promises, the book simply confirmed what they already believed, that Norman Baker was a great man, persecuted by those who feared his truth. In 1937, federal prosecutors finally managed to catch Baker on a charge that would stick. He was convicted of violating the Brinkley Clause of the Federal Communications Act of 1934 by shipping gramophone recordings out of the nation for broadcast purposes. This was the same legal strategy that had been used successfully against John Brinkley. Baker's conviction was eventually overturned on appeal, but the legal troubles were mounting, and Baker must have sensed that his time in Iowa and Texas was running out. He needed a new base of operations, a place where he could continue his fraudulent medical practice, where desperate patients could come to him rather than relying entirely on radio advertisements. He needed, in other words, a hospital. And in July 1937, Baker found the perfect location for his new venture. The Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, was sitting empty, its previous incarnations as a resort and a school both having ended in failure. The town of Eureka Springs itself was struggling economically. The glory days of the healing water boom long past, the population having shrunk from its peak of 15,000 down to a few thousand permanent residents. Town leaders were desperate for anything that might bring jobs and revenue back to Eureka Springs. When Norman Baker arrived with his smooth talk and his promises, when he announced plans to transform the Crescent Hotel into a cancer hospital, when he pledged to bring patients and their families from all over the country to seek treatment, the city council welcomed him with open arms. They didn't ask too many questions about Baker's credentials or his past legal troubles. They saw only the possibility of economic revival. Baker purchased the Crescent Hotel and immediately began an extravagant renovation, pouring what he claimed was $500,000 into the project, an enormous sum in 1937. But this wasn't a restoration to the hotel's Victorian elegance. This was a transformation into Norman Baker's bizarre personal vision. Baker had a favorite color, lavender, or as he sometimes called it, purple. He had his cars painted lavender. He wore lavender shirts and ties. His radio station's literature was printed in lavender. And now, he had the interior of the Crescent Hotel painted in various shades of lavender and purple. The grand Victorian woodwork disappeared under coats of purple paint. The elegant public rooms were transformed into garish displays of Baker's ego. The exterior sign that had once welcomed guests to the Crescent Hotel was replaced with a new sign that made a promise as brazen as it was false. We cure cancer. The Baker Cancer Hospital, as it was now officially called, opened for business with great fanfare. Baker launched a $1 million advertising campaign, placing ads in newspapers and magazines across the country, sending out brochures with elaborate claims and testimonials. The message was simple and seductive. We cure cancer tumor without operation, radium, or X-ray. We treat all ailments. We do not cut any organ. For people facing a cancer diagnosis in 1937, this was exactly what they wanted to hear. No surgery, no radiation burns, no agony, just gentle treatment with natural substances in a beautiful mountain setting. The hospital promised not just a cure, but a pleasant experience, luxurious accommodations, fine dining, the healing waters of Eureka Springs, all while Baker's miracle treatment worked its magic. Patients began to arrive, some driven by family members, others making the journey alone, all of them carrying with them their life savings and the desperate hope that Norman Baker really had discovered what the medical establishment had missed. They checked in at the Crescent's front desk, no longer a hotel desk, but a hospital reception. They were assigned rooms, the same rooms that had once housed wealthy tourists and young women attending school. But now these rooms had been converted, at least nominally, into hospital rooms. The furnishings were basic, the atmosphere clinical despite the purple paint. And then the treatments began. What exactly did Norman Baker do to these cancer patients? The core of his treatment was injections of his so-called Formula 5, which he sometimes called his cure. The exact composition varied, but it generally contained alcohol, glycerol, carbolic acid, phenol, ground watermelon seed, corn silk, and clover leaves. Let's be very clear about what this mixture could and could not do. It could not cure cancer. It could not even slow the progression of cancer. The active ingredient, to the extent there was one, was the alcohol, which might have provided some pain relief, though not for long and not very effectively. The carbolic acid was actually harmful, potentially poisonous, capable of causing tissue damage and systemic toxicity. The watermelon seeds, corn silk, and clover were essentially harmless, but also completely useless as cancer treatments. This mixture was injected directly into the tumors, sometimes up to 7 times a day, a painful process that accomplished nothing except perhaps to damage the tissue further and introduce potential infections. In addition to the injections, patients were given various tonics to drink, concoctions of vegetables, herbs, roots, and barks that Baker claimed had healing properties. They were put on special diets heavy on carrot juice and other vegetables. They were given castor oil, ostensibly for cleansing. They were given needle treatments of various kinds, though what these were supposed to accomplish was never clear. The one thing that all of these treatments had in common was that they were completely ineffective against cancer. Modern medicine understands that cancer is a complex disease, a disorder of cellular growth and regulation that requires aggressive intervention with surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, or increasingly sophisticated targeted therapies. None of Baker's treatments addressed the actual mechanisms of cancer. They were at best placebos. At worst, they were actively harmful, weakening patients who were already gravely ill. But Baker didn't need his treatments to actually work. He needed his patients to believe they were working, at least for a while. And he had developed strategies to maintain that belief even as the patients grew sicker. One of the most cruel tactics was that Baker would force dying patients to write letters home to their families, letters that had to be positive and uplifting, letters that had to say that they were feeling better, that the treatments were working, that the Baker Hospital was indeed performing miracles. These patients, weakened by disease and by Baker's worthless treatments, in pain despite whatever palliatives they were given, would sit down and compose lies for the consumption of their loved ones. They did this because they had no choice. Baker and his staff made it clear that cooperation was expected, that complaining or expressing doubts would result in termination of treatment and expulsion from the hospital. And where would they go then? They had already spent their life savings to come here. They had burned their bridges with conventional medicine. They had nowhere else to turn. So they wrote the letters, and their families back home received them and felt reassured, felt hopeful, felt grateful that they had found this wonderful Dr. Baker who was saving their loved one when all the conventional doctors had given up. The families didn't know that their loved one was actually getting worse, not better. They didn't know that what awaited them was not a joyful reunion with a cured family member, but eventually a telegram or phone call informing them of a death that they had been told was not going to happen. What happened when a patient's condition deteriorated to the point where Baker could no longer maintain the fiction that they were improving? What happened when the cancer progressed despite the injections and tonics? When the pain became unbearable? When it became obvious to everyone that death was approaching? Baker had a system for that too, a system that revealed his complete lack of human compassion or moral sense. Patients who were clearly dying were moved to a special section of the hospital, a place that Baker's staff euphemistically called the pain ward. This was located on the third floor, away from the other patients, where the dying could be isolated so their suffering wouldn't disturb or frighten those who still harbored hope. In the pain ward, patients received morphine or other opiates to manage their agony, but little else. They lay in their beds, conscious that they had been abandoned, that the miracle cure had failed, that they had spent their fortune and traveled hundreds of miles for nothing. And when they died, which they did with grim regularity, their bodies were not taken out the front door of the hospital. That would be bad for business, would contradict the image of the Baker Hospital as a place where people got well. No, the bodies were taken down to the basement, to what had once been a storage area or mechanical room, but which Baker had converted into a morgue. The basement morgue was a cold, stark space with stone floors and walls, dimly lit, with a chill that seeped into your bones. Here, the bodies of Baker's victims, for that is what they were laid out on tables. Baker, despite having no medical degree, despite having no training in pathology or anatomy, would sometimes perform autopsies, cutting into the bodies of the people he had failed to heal, perhaps trying to maintain the pretense of scientific inquiry, perhaps simply indulging a morbid curiosity. More often, the autopsies were performed by whatever unqualified staff he had hired, people who, like Baker himself, had no business calling themselves medical professionals. After the autopsies, the bodies were prepared for transport. Families were notified of the deaths, and arrangements were made for the bodies to be sent home or to local cemeteries. The bodies left through a discreet back entrance, carried in the dark of night so that other patients and their families wouldn't see the grim evidence of Baker's failure. But Baker didn't just leave it at that. He kept specimens from some of the autopsies. Tumors, tissue samples, organs, all preserved in alcohol or formaldehyde and stored in glass bottles and jars. He kept these in his morgue, a grotesque collection that served no legitimate medical or scientific purpose. These were his trophies, in a sense, evidence of the people whose lives he had taken through his fraud and negligence. Some of these bottles and specimens were eventually discovered decades later, in 2019, when groundskeepers working behind the hotel accidentally unearthed a cache of hundreds of glass bottles that had been buried in the earth. Inside some of these bottles were tissue samples, tumors, medical specimens, all dating back to Baker's time. Other bottles contained remnants of Baker's various cures, including multiple bottles labeled as Formula 5. The discovery made headlines and added another chapter to the dark history of the Baker Cancer Hospital. These bottles were sent to the Arkansas State Crime Lab and the University of Arkansas for medical sciences for analysis. Some of them are now on display at the Crescent Hotel, a chilling reminder of the horrors that took place within its walls. How many people died under Norman Baker's care at the Crescent Hotel? The exact number is impossible to determine with certainty because Baker's record-keeping was haphazard and because many records were destroyed or lost after his arrest. But various sources, including court documents and contemporary news reports, suggest that at least 44 patients died at the hospital in just the 20 months that Baker operated it, from late 1937 until early 1940. 44 people who came seeking a miracle cure and found only death. 44 families who paid enormous sums and received back only a body. 44 lives cut short not by cancer alone, but by the fraudulent actions of a man who valued money above human life. The patients who died weren't the only victims. Those who survived their time at the Baker Hospital, who eventually sought conventional medical treatment when Baker's methods obviously weren't working, often found that their cancers had progressed beyond the point where they could be helped. The delay in receiving real treatment, the months spent receiving worthless injections of Baker's Formula 5, these cost people precious time that they didn't have. Someone might have been saved by early surgery or radiation died because they had waited too long, trusting in Norman Baker's promises. The emotional and financial toll on families was also devastating. Life savings were gone. Hope had been raised and then crushed. The suffering of their loved ones had been prolonged unnecessarily. And all of this was because of one man's greed and complete lack of moral compass. Baker's paranoia grew as his operation continued. He knew that he was being investigated, that federal authorities were building a case against him. He installed bulletproof glass in his office at the hospital. He kept 2 Thompson submachine guns within easy reach at all times. He suspected, correctly, that the government was monitoring his activities, reading his mail, perhaps even having informants among his staff. But he continued operating the hospital, continued taking money from desperate patients, continued administering his worthless treatments, because the money was too good to walk away from. At the height of his operation, Baker was bringing in an estimated $500,000 per year, equivalent to many millions of dollars in today's money. This was a fortune, especially during the Depression, and Baker wasn't about to give it up without a fight. But the federal government was building its case methodically. They couldn't prosecute Baker for practicing medicine without a license in Arkansas because, technically, he never claimed to be a physician. He called himself a scientist, an inventor, a healer, anything but a doctor. The state medical board had no jurisdiction over someone who didn't claim to be practicing medicine. So federal prosecutors focused on something they could prove: mail fraud. Baker had used the United States Postal Service extensively to promote his hospital, sending out thousands of pieces of advertising, corresponding with patients and potential patients, collecting payments through the mail. All of this constituted wire fraud and mail fraud under federal law, and it fell under federal jurisdiction. In 1939, federal authorities arrested Norman Baker and charged him with multiple counts of mail fraud. The case went to trial, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence of Baker's fraudulent claims and worthless treatments. Patients and their families testified about the false promises that had been made, about the money they had paid, about the suffering and death that had resulted. Medical experts testified that Baker's treatments had no scientific basis and could not possibly cure cancer or any other serious disease. The defense tried to argue that Baker genuinely believed in his treatments, that he was not intentionally defrauding anyone, but this argument fell flat. The evidence of Baker's cynical manipulation of patients and their families was too strong to ignore. In January 1940, the court found Baker guilty. The judge, in his ruling, described Baker's cure as a pure hoax and declared his claims utterly false. Baker was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison at Leavenworth, Kansas, and ordered to pay $4,000 in restitution, a pittance compared to the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had stolen from desperate patients over the years. Baker appealed the conviction all the way to the United States Supreme Court, but the court declined to hear his case, letting the lower court's ruling stand. Norman Baker entered Leavenworth in May 1941 and served his time until July 1944. Even in prison, his troubles continued. R.A. Bellows, one of Baker's associates who was also convicted and imprisoned for his role in the fraud, sued Baker for breach of contract, claiming that Baker had not paid him his agreed-upon share of the profits from the hospital. The suit described Bellows, perhaps too generously, as an ignorant country barber, until Baker hired him. Bellows died while still incarcerated before his lawsuit could be resolved, and presumably never received any of the money he claimed he was owed. While Baker was in prison, XCNT went silent, his radio empire crumbling without his presence. The Crescent Hotel stood empty, its purple paint fading, its morgue silent, its rooms no longer filled with the desperate and dying. Eureka Springs, which had welcomed Baker so enthusiastically in 1937, now tried to forget that he had ever been there, tried to wash away the stain of his presence. The town had hoped Baker would bring economic revival, and he had, but at what cost? The reputation of Eureka Springs had been tarnished by association with one of the most notorious medical frauds in American history. The healing waters that had once drawn thousands of visitors were now associated in the public mind with quackery and death. When Baker was released from prison in 1944, he was a broken man, at least financially and reputationally. His radio stations were gone. His hospital was gone. Most of his money had been seized or spent on legal fees. He moved to Florida, where he lived out his remaining years in obscurity, reportedly on a borrowed boat. The charismatic showman, the radio personality who had commanded audiences of hundreds of thousands, the man who had lived in luxury on the proceeds of his fraud, was reduced to near poverty and anonymity. Norman Baker died on September 10, 1958, from liver cancer, the same disease he had claimed to be able to cure. There's a bitter irony in that, a kind of cosmic justice that Baker's own body was destroyed by the very disease he had exploited for profit. He was 75 years old, and he died knowing that history would remember him not as the great healer and crusader he had pretended to be, but as one of the most ruthless quacks in American history, a man whose greed and deception had caused immeasurable suffering and death. But even death could not free Norman Baker from the Crescent Hotel, The spirits of those who die traumatically, who die with unfinished business, who die in places where great evil was committed. These spirits are said to remain tied to the locations of their suffering. And Norman Baker, despite dying in Florida far from Eureka Springs, far from the purple-painted halls where he had committed his crimes, would return. His spirit would be seen again in the lobby of the Crescent Hotel, dressed in his signature white linen suit, his lavender shirt visible beneath, walking through the spaces where he had once reigned, perhaps still unable to comprehend the depth of his crimes, perhaps condemned to eternally revisit the scene of his greatest triumphs and his ultimate downfall. And he would not be alone. The patients who died in the Baker Hospital, who drew their last breaths in those rooms, who suffered through pointless injections and false hope, their spirits would remain as well. The most famous of these is a woman known simply as Theodora, though whether that was truly her name or just a name that has been attached to a presence, no one can say with certainty. Theodora is believed to have been a cancer patient, one of the many who came to the Baker Hospital seeking healing and found only death. But unlike most of Baker's victims, whose spirits seem to have moved on, Theodora chose to stay, or perhaps was unable to leave. Her presence would be felt most strongly in and around room 419, where she is often seen standing outside the door, fumbling through her purse, searching for the key to her room, perhaps still not understanding that she no longer needs keys, that doors are no barrier to those who have passed beyond the veil. The Crescent Hotel, having served as a grand resort, a girls' school, and a fraudulent cancer hospital, would eventually be given a chance at redemption. But the damage had been done. The spirits had accumulated. The building had absorbed so much suffering, so much death, so much darkness, that it could never return to simple innocence. It would always be haunted, always be a place where the past refused to stay buried, where the dead walked alongside the living, where every creak and shadow might be something more than mere physics and imagination. Norman Baker had transformed the Crescent into a house of horrors, and that transformation proved to be permanent in ways that even he, with all his grandiose visions, could never have imagined. The hotel's long road to redemption. After Norman Baker's conviction and imprisonment in 1940, the Crescent Hotel stood abandoned once again. The purple paint that Baker had slathered over the Victorian woodwork had begun to fade and peel. The grand lobby, which had once welcomed wealthy tourists in their finest attire, which had seen young women in their school uniforms hurrying to classes, which had witnessed Baker's victims checking in with desperate hope in their eyes, now stood silent and empty. Dust accumulated on the furniture that remained. The crystal dining room, where so many elegant dinners had been served, where couples had danced to orchestras, where students had taken their meals, where Baker's patients had eaten their prescribed diets of vegetables and carrot juice, now sat dark and unused. The windows, dozens of them looking out over the Ozark Mountains in every direction, stared blindly at the forest and hills, reflecting nothing but clouds and sky. The building itself was structurally sound. Those Irish stonemasons had done their work well. The limestone walls, 18 inches thick, showed no signs of crumbling or decay. The foundations were solid. The massive timbers that supported the floors and roof were still strong. But a building is more than just stone and wood. A building needs life, needs people moving through its spaces, needs light in its windows and warmth in its rooms. Without these things, even the strongest structure begins to die in its own way. Paint peels, plaster cracks, Pipes freeze and burst in winter. Roofs develop leaks that go unrepaired, allowing water to seep in and damage everything it touches. Nature begins to reclaim what humans have abandoned, with vines creeping up the walls, birds nesting in the eaves, small animals finding ways inside to make their homes in the empty rooms. For 6 years, from 1940 to 1946, the Crescent Hotel sat in this limbo, neither fully abandoned nor occupied, a monument to failure and tragedy perched on its mountaintop, visible for miles around as a reminder of what had been and what had been lost. The town of Eureka Springs struggled economically during these years. World War II had drawn away many of the town's young men. Rationing and the demands of the war economy meant that tourism, always Eureka Springs' economic lifeblood, had dried to a trickle. The healing waters that had once drawn thousands were now largely forgotten, relegated to the status of quaint historical curiosity. The town had a few thousand permanent residents, many of them elderly, many of them barely scraping by. The grand Victorian houses that climbed the hillsides, built during the boom years of the 1880s and 1890s, were beginning to show their age, their ornate woodwork in need of paint, their windows in need of repair. Eureka Springs was dying slowly, and the empty Crescent Hotel looming over the town seemed like a symbol of that decline, a ghost of better days. But in the spring of 1946, for men saw possibility where others saw only ruin. John Hua Constantini Herberti, Shutter, Herbert Byfield, and Dwight Nichols were businessmen and investors who believed that Eureka Springs could be revived, that the Crescent Hotel could be restored, that tourism could be brought back to the Ozark Mountains. They purchased the property and began the long, difficult process of undoing the damage that years of neglect and Baker's bizarre renovations had caused. The purple paint had to be removed or painted over. The hospital equipment had to be cleared out. The morgue in the basement had to be cleaned and repurposed. Rooms had to be renovated and refurnished. The electrical system needed upgrading. The plumbing, which had suffered from freezing during the winters when the building stood empty and unheated, needed extensive repairs. It was a massive undertaking, requiring significant capital and a great deal of faith that the investment would eventually pay off. The new owners understood that they needed a draw, something that would attract visitors to Eureka Springs and to the Crescent Hotel specifically. They partnered with the Frisco Railroad to create travel vacation packages that would bring tourists from cities like St. Louis, combining scenic train journeys through the Ozarks with stays at the newly renovated Crescent Hotel. These all-inclusive packages provided travelers with transportation, lodging, meals, and various activities, creating an affordable and convenient getaway for middle-class families. The strategy worked, at least partially. Visitors began to return to Eureka Springs. The Crescent Hotel began to fill its rooms again. The dining room served meals again. The lobby echoed with conversation and laughter again. It was not the grand resort of the 1880s, and it certainly was not attracting the wealthy society figures who had once made the Crescent their destination of choice. But it was alive again, functional again, serving a purpose again. For more than 20 years, the Crescent Hotel operated in this modest capacity, never particularly profitable, but managing to sustain itself. The ownership changed hands within the group of original investors as some died or sold their shares. By the 1960s, Dwight Nichols was the sole living owner, and he continued to maintain the property as best he could with limited resources. But then, on March 15, 1967, disaster struck. Fire broke out in the upper floors of the hotel, and it spread quickly through the old building. The Crescent Hotel, which had survived so much over its 8 decades of existence, which had endured the deaths of construction workers and students, which had been desecrated by Norman Baker's purple paint and his morgue, which had stood empty through harsh Ozark winters and hot summers, now faced its greatest threat. The Eureka Springs Fire Department responded, but fighting a fire in a building perched on a mountaintop with limited water pressure and access difficulties was an enormous challenge. The firefighters worked through the night, pouring water on the flames, trying to prevent the fire from spreading to the lower floors and destroying the entire structure. They succeeded, but barely. The 5th floor was completely destroyed, its rooms gutted, its roof collapsed. The floors below suffered smoke and water damage. The grand old building that had taken 2 years to construct, that had been built to last for centuries, had come within hours of being reduced to nothing but a limestone shell and a pile of ashes. When morning came and the smoke cleared, Dwight Nichols stood looking at what remained of his investment and had to make a decision. He could walk away, sell the damaged property for whatever he could get, let someone else deal with the enormous expense of reconstruction, or he could rebuild. Nichols chose to rebuild, though with his limited resources, the reconstruction was slow and incomplete. The 5th floor was redesigned and reconstructed, but not exactly as it had been before. The skyline of the building was recreated to match the original as closely as possible, but the interior of the 5th floor was finished in a simpler, more utilitarian style than the ornate Victorian design of the original. Still, the building survived, and it continued to operate as a hotel, continuing to serve the tourists who came to Eureka Springs seeking not healing waters, but simply a pleasant getaway in the mountains. But the Crescent Hotel was tired. By the 1990s, it had been through too much, seen too much, survived too much. The building was 90 years old, and it looked every year of that age. The plumbing and electrical systems were outdated and unreliable. The rooms were shabby, furnished with decades-old furniture that had seen better days. The carpets were worn thin. The paint was faded. The whole property had a run-down, neglected air that no amount of cleaning could disguise. Fewer and fewer guests chose to stay at the Crescent when there were newer, more modern hotels available elsewhere in Eureka Springs. The grand old hotel seemed to be approaching the end of its useful life, heading toward either total abandonment or demolition. Then, in 1997, Marty and Elise Roenick came to Eureka Springs. The Roenicks were historic-preservationists with a passion for saving old buildings and restoring them to their original glory. They had experience with this kind of work, having successfully renovated other historic properties. When they saw the Crescent Hotel, they saw not a tired old building on its last legs, but a masterpiece of Victorian architecture that deserved to be saved, that deserved to be returned to the elegance and grandeur that its original builders had envisioned. They purchased the property for $3 million, a significant sum, but a fraction of what the building's replacement cost would have been, and they began what would become a 6-year restoration project. The Roenicks brought in Jack Moyer to serve as general manager. Moyer had extensive experience in the hospitality industry, having worked for Hilton Hotels and Resorts, Namaqualand Woodlands Resort, and Adams Mark Hotels and Resorts before taking on the role of general manager at the Basin Park Hotel in Eureka Springs in 1995. He knew hotels, knew hospitality, knew what modern travelers expected, but he also understood and appreciated historic buildings and the importance of preserving their character while updating their amenities. The formula for success, as Marty Roenick described it, was simple. Jack's plan plus Marty's money equals sustainability. The restoration was comprehensive and painstaking. Every room was gutted and renovated. The Victorian color schemes were carefully researched and recreated, with hand stenciling by artist Richard Pollard applied to walls throughout the hotel. The lobby received special attention, with its original woodwork restored and refinished, the massive fireplace cleaned and repaired, new period-appropriate furniture installed. The crystal dining room was transformed back into an elegant space worthy of its name. Bathrooms in the guest rooms were completely rebuilt with modern plumbing and fixtures while maintaining period-appropriate tile and design elements. The 19th century rooms were cleverly redesigned to appeal to modern guests without sacrificing their historic character. Modern heating and air conditioning systems were installed, hidden as much as possible to preserve the visual authenticity of the spaces. The electrical system was completely rewired to handle modern demands while hiding the evidence of 21st century technology behind Victorian facades. The fifth floor, which had been destroyed in the 1967 fire and rebuilt in a utilitarian style, received special attention. The Roenicks had the interior completely redone as luxury living quarters for themselves, with Victorian styling that matched the rest of the hotel. The exterior skyline had already been recreated to match the original, and now the interior was brought up to the same standard. In 2008, 4 two-bedroom treetop cottages were added to the hotel's 15-acre mountaintop property, built in a style that blended seamlessly with Eureka Springs Victorian architecture and inspired by the arts and crafts movement. These cottages provided additional luxury accommodations while preserving the historic character of the main building. Throughout the restoration, the Roenicks made a conscious decision to embrace rather than hide the hotel's dark history. They recognized that Norman Baker's cancer hospital, tragic and horrifying as it was, had become part of the building's story, part of what made the Crescent Hotel unique. The morgue in the basement was preserved and restored, not as a functioning morgue obviously, but as a historical exhibit and a stop on the ghost tours that would become one of the hotel's signature offerings. Some of the bottles and medical equipment from Baker's time were put on display. The history of the fraudulent cancer treatments was documented and shared openly with guests and visitors, not glorifying Baker's crimes, but acknowledging them as part of the complex history of this place. And then there were the ghosts. By the late 1990s, stories of paranormal activity at the Crescent Hotel had been circulating for decades. Staff members reported strange experiences. Guests occasionally mentioned seeing or hearing things they couldn't explain. But these stories have been largely dismissed or downplayed by previous owners who worried that a reputation for being haunted would drive away business. The Roenicks took a different approach. They realized that many people are fascinated by the paranormal, that the possibility of encountering a ghost is not frightening, but exciting to a significant segment of the traveling public. They began to market the Crescent Hotel not just as a historic Victorian resort, but as potentially the most haunted hotel in America, a place where the veil between the living and the dead seemed particularly thin, where spirits walked the halls and made their presence known to those willing to look and listen. Nightly ghost tours were instituted, leading guests through the hotel's haunted history, stopping in the most active locations, sharing the stories of Michael the Stonemason, Theodora the cancer patient, Dr. Ellis with his pipe tobacco, Little Brecky with his bouncing ball, and the various other spirits that supposedly inhabited the building. The basement morgue became the climax of the tour, with guests descending into the cold stone rooms where Norman Baker's victims had been autopsied and prepared for burial. The tours were wildly popular, selling out night after night, especially in October when interest in the paranormal reaches its peak around Halloween. The hotel began to attract paranormal investigators, both amateur and professional. Groups would book rooms specifically in the hope of encountering something supernatural. They would bring electromagnetic field detectors, digital voice recorders, infrared cameras, and various other ghost hunting equipment, spending the night trying to capture evidence of the paranormal. Some came away convinced they had experienced genuine contact with spirits. Others left disappointed, having experienced nothing unusual. But the reputation grew and spread. The Crescent Hotel began to appear on television programs devoted to the paranormal, including Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, My Ghost Story, and Paranormal Witness. Each appearance brought more attention, more curiosity, more visitors who wanted to experience this allegedly haunted hotel for themselves. In 2009, tragedy struck the Roenick family. Marty Roenick died in a car crash, leaving his wife Elise to continue operating the hotel with Jack Moyer. It was a devastating loss, both personally for Elise and for the hotel, which had been Marty's passion project. But the work continued. Elise remained the owner, committed to maintaining the standards of restoration and operation that she and Marty had established. Jack Moyer continued as general manager, his quarter-century of dedication to the Crescent Hotel making him one of the most knowledgeable people about the building and its history. Together, they ensured that Marty's vision lived on. In 2016, the Crescent Hotel received formal recognition of its historical significance when it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This designation acknowledged not just the building's architectural importance, but its role in the history of Eureka Springs and the Ozark region. It was official confirmation of what the Roenicks had believed all along, that the Crescent Hotel was worth saving, that it was an irreplaceable piece of American architectural heritage, that its story mattered and deserved to be preserved and shared with future generations. Today, the 1886 Crescent Hotel and Spa stands as a testament to resilience and rebirth. It is a member of Historic Hotels of America, recognized as one of the finest examples of Victorian resort architecture in the United States. It offers 72 guest rooms and 12 luxury suites, each uniquely decorated and furnished with period-appropriate pieces that evoke the elegance of the Victorian era while providing all the modern amenities that contemporary travelers expect. The Crystal Dining Room serves fine cuisine that has earned recognition from Wine Spectator and other culinary authorities. The New Moon Spa offers a full range of treatments in a facility that includes a hot tub, infrared sauna, spa lawn, hot pool, and yoga studio. The Sky Bar serves craft cocktails and has won local awards for its pizza and calzones. The hotel's 15 acres of grounds include formal gardens and nature trails, providing guests with opportunities to explore the natural beauty of the Ozarks. But beyond all these amenities and accolades, beyond the successful business that the hotel has become, beyond its reputation as a destination for both luxury and the paranormal, the Crescent Hotel remains a place where the past is never far from the present, where the spirits of those who died within its walls continue to make their presence known, where history is not something that happened long ago, but something that continues to unfold with each passing day and night. The spirits who walk these halls. To understand the haunting of the Crescent Hotel, you must first understand that this is not a simple ghost story with a single spirit and a single explanation. This is a layered haunting, an accumulation of presences that spans the entire history of the building from its construction in the 1880s through its various incarnations to the present day. The spirits here are not all alike. They have different origins, different reasons for remaining, different ways of making their presence known. Some are playful and mischievous. Others are sad and confused. Some seem to have specific purposes or messages they are trying to convey. Others simply exist, going through the motions of lives that ended long ago, perhaps not even aware that they have died. Let us begin with Michael, the Irish stonemason, whose death during the hotel's construction made him perhaps the oldest spirit in residence at the Crescent. Michael was 17 years old when he fell to his death, striking the beam that would become part of room 218. Think about that for a moment. 17. Barely more than a boy, really still full of the confidence and immortality complex that young men often have, probably thinking he would work on this building and then others, would make a name for himself as a master stonemason, would perhaps return to Ireland someday with money in his pocket and stories to tell, or perhaps would stay in America and build a life here, marry, have children, grow old surrounded by the buildings he had helped create. All of that future, all that potential, snuffed out in an instant of carelessness, a lean too far, a loss of balance, and then the fall, the impact, death. Is it any wonder that Michael's spirit remained? Death at such a young age, death so sudden and violent, death that came before he had really begun to live. These are the circumstances that, according to paranormal theories, create what are called residual hauntings or intelligent hauntings. A residual haunting is like a recording, an echo of a traumatic event that plays over and over without consciousness or intelligence behind it. An intelligent haunting is different, involving a spirit that retains some awareness, some ability to interact with the living, some unfinished business or attachment that keeps it bound to the earthly plane. Michael's haunting seems to be intelligent rather than residual. He doesn't just repeat the same actions mindlessly. He interacts with guests and staff. He makes choices about when and how to manifest his presence. And he definitely has preferences. Multiple witnesses over the decades have reported that Michael particularly focuses his attention on women, especially attractive young women. This makes sense given the legend of how he died, trying to get the attention of a pretty girl. In death, it seems, Michael continues to be the flirt he was in life, though his methods of interaction would probably be considered harassment if he were a living person. Room 218, where Michael's body fell, has become known as Michael's Room, and it is one of the most requested rooms in the hotel, especially among paranormal enthusiasts. Guests who stay in this room report a wide range of phenomena. The lights flicker on and off with no electrical explanation. The television turns itself on and off, sometimes changing channels on its own. The doors to the balcony, even when securely locked, will swing open suddenly, dramatically, as if someone has thrown them wide. The shower curtain gets pulled back when someone is showering, a particularly disconcerting experience when you are alone in the bathroom and can see that no one else is there. Objects get moved around. Curtains and towels are tied into elaborate knots. Personal belongings are repositioned when guests leave the room and return. But the most disturbing reports from room 218 involve direct physical contact. Women staying in the room have felt hands touching them, usually on the shoulders or back, gentle touches that nevertheless are unmistakably deliberate. Some have felt weight settling on the bed, as if someone had sat down beside them. A few have reported feeling someone lie down next to them, feeling the mattress compress and the covers move. In one notorious incident during a ghost tour, a young woman celebrating her 18th birthday volunteered to lie on the bed in room 218 and try to make contact with Michael. According to multiple witnesses present for the event, she suddenly felt an invisible presence pressing down on top of her, an experience so frightening and overwhelming that she had to be helped from the room in tears. Michael is also auditory as well as tactile in his manifestations. Guests in room 218 and in the rooms adjacent to it frequently report hearing loud pounding on the walls, as if someone is hammering or striking the wall with great force. Sometimes these sounds seem to come from inside the walls themselves, which is particularly unsettling. Other times, guests have heard what sounds like a man crying out or screaming, the sound seeming to come from the ceiling or from somewhere above them. Paranormal investigators suggest that this might be Michael reliving the moment of his fall and death, the sound of his scream echoing through time. Perhaps most chilling are the reports of hands coming out of the bathroom mirror. Multiple guests, spread over many years and with no knowledge of each other's experiences, have reported seeing hands emerge from the reflective surface of the mirror, reaching out toward them. These are not vague shadows or tricks of light, but detailed, solid-looking hands that appear to be trying to grab or touch the person looking at the mirror. This particular manifestation is so consistent and so specific that it's difficult to dismiss as imagination or misperception. Michael's presence is not confined entirely to room 218. He has been reported in the hallways on the second floor, particularly in the area near his room. Staff members walking the halls late at night, when the hotel is quiet, have reported seeing a figure of a young man with red hair, dressed in work clothes from the 1880s, standing in the hallway or walking toward room 218 before vanishing. Some have reported feeling a presence walking with them, hearing footsteps matching their own even though they can see no one else is there. A few brave or foolish individuals have tried to speak to Michael, asking him questions, trying to establish communication. Sometimes they report feeling a response, a change in the air temperature, a sudden breeze with no source, a sense of acknowledgement, even if no words are actually heard. Jack Moyer, the hotel's general manager, has stated that he has personally heard more than 5,000 accounts of unexplained happenings at the Crescent Hotel during his time there, and many of those involve Michael. Moyer himself, who was initially skeptical about the paranormal claims, has become a believer after his own experiences in the building, including participating in paranormal investigations that have captured what appears to be evidence of supernatural activity. If Michael is the hotel's most famous male ghost, then Theodora is certainly its most famous female spirit. Unlike Michael, whose death during construction is well documented in the hotel's history, Theodora's identity is more mysterious and contested. The most common version of her story identifies her as a cancer patient who came to the Baker Hospital seeking treatment and who died there, as so many did. Her name supposedly comes from the fact that she has been heard to identify herself when encountering housekeepers and other hotel staff, saying, "I'm Theodora," before vanishing. Whether this was actually her name in life or just a name that has become attached to this particular spirit is uncertain. Theodora's primary haunt is room 419 on the 4th floor, though like Michael, she is not confined exclusively to one location. The most common sighting involves seeing her standing in the hallway outside room 419, fumbling through her purse, apparently searching for her room key. She appears as a young woman, usually described as being in her 20s or 30s, dressed in clothing from the 1930s or 1940s. Witnesses report that she looks solid and real, not transparent or obviously ghostly, which is why some people who encounter her initially think she's another guest and might even speak to her or ask if she needs help. It's only when she vanishes suddenly, disappearing while they're looking right at her, that they realize what they've seen. Housekeeping staff at the Crescent Hotel have had the most encounters with Theodora, probably because they spend more time in the guest rooms and hallways than anyone else. They report entering room 419 to clean and finding that someone has already straightened the room, folding and hanging clothes that guests had left draped over chairs or scattered on the bed, organizing spare change on the dresser by denomination, arranging toiletries on the bathroom counter in neat rows. At first, housekeepers might assume that the guests themselves had tidied up before going out for the day. But when this happens in rooms that have just been vacated, or when guests specifically mention that they did not organize their belongings in the ways that the housekeepers found them, the supernatural explanation becomes harder to dismiss. According to the staff, Theodora has opinions about the guests who stay in her room. If she likes them, she will help by tidying their belongings and generally making their stay more pleasant. If she doesn't like them, well, things might go missing, clothes might become wrinkled or disorganized, small annoyances might accumulate. She is described as very opinionated and not afraid to show off, which suggests an intelligent haunting with a personality that has been preserved beyond death. This is consistent with other accounts of Theodora that describe her as having been a strong-willed, independent woman in life, someone who came to the Baker Hospital not as a passive victim, but as someone actively seeking a cure, someone who refused to give up hope even as her condition worsened. One of the most touching aspects of Theodora's haunting is the suggestion that she continues to care for guests in room 419 as a way of finding purpose or meaning in her continued existence. In life, she cannot be cured. She died far from home, in a place that had promised healing but delivered only false hope and eventual death. Perhaps in death, she has found a way to help others, even in small ways, by ensuring that guests in her room feel cared for and comfortable. It's a sad and beautiful thought that this spirit might be motivated not by anger or confusion, but by a desire to be useful, to matter, to make a difference even after death. Then there is Dr. John Fremont Ellis, who served as the Crescent Hotel's house physician during its early years as a resort in the late 19th century. Dr. Ellis was a legitimate doctor, not a fraud like Norman Baker, and he apparently took his duties seriously, caring for guests who fell ill during their stays, perhaps even saving lives through his ministrations. He would have been a familiar figure to the hotel's guests, probably making daily rounds, checking on anyone who was under the weather, offering advice about taking the waters at the various springs, providing whatever medical care was possible given the limitations of Victorian-era medicine. Dr. Ellis died and was buried in the local cemetery, with a headstone that notes his service to the Crescent Hotel. But it seems Dr. Ellis has returned to continue making his rounds. His ghost is most commonly encountered on the second floor, particularly in and around room 212, which was apparently his office or the location where he saw patients. The most common way people know Dr. Ellis is present is through smell rather than sight. Multiple guests and staff members have reported smelling cherry pipe tobacco in areas of the hotel where smoking is strictly prohibited and has been for years. The smell is distinctive and strong, not a faint whiff that could be dismissed as imagination, but a thick, sweet aroma that fills a room or hallway. It appears suddenly, lingers for a few minutes, and then dissipates just as suddenly. When people do see Dr. Ellis, he is usually described as appearing solid and real, a distinguished-looking gentleman with a beard and mustache, dressed in formal Victorian clothing, sometimes carrying a black medical bag of the type that doctors used in that era. He is most often seen in the second-floor hallways, walking with purpose as if making his rounds, checking on patients. Sometimes he is seen descending the main staircase from the second floor to the lobby. A few people have reported seeing him in the lobby itself, sitting in one of the chairs or standing near the fireplace, always silent, always vanishing when approached or when the witness looks away for a moment. Dr. Ellis's ghost seems benign, even comforting. There are no reports of him frightening people or causing disturbances. He simply continues his work, making his rounds, checking on the guests, perhaps still fulfilling the duties he took seriously in life. It's a poignant kind of haunting, suggesting that some spirits remain not because of trauma or unfinished business in the traditional sense, but because their sense of duty and purpose was so strong that it transcends death itself. Clifton Breckenridge Thompson is perhaps the saddest of all the Crescent Hotel's ghosts. He was only 4 years old when he died of appendicitis, too young to understand what was happening to him, too young to comprehend that death meant he would never see his parents again, never grow up, never experience all the things that childhood should lead to. Brecky died during the years when the Crescent operated as a school, when his father was probably the dean or another administrator living on the property with his family. The little boy would have known every inch of this building, would have explored its halls and stairways, would have run and played in spaces that now host adult guests and ghost tours. Brecky's ghost is most commonly encountered on the second floor, particularly in the hallway and on the main staircase. He is usually described as a small boy with curly blonde hair, dressed in old-fashioned clothing that would date to the 1910s or early 1920s. The most distinctive aspect of Brecky's haunting is the red ball that he is often seen or heard bouncing. Guests and staff have reported hearing the rhythmic bounce of a ball on the floor or stairs. Thump, 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 steady and repetitive, but when they look to see who is bouncing the ball, no one is visible. Others have reported seeing a red ball rolling or bouncing by itself, defying gravity by bouncing upstairs or rolling up slight inclines. Children who stay at the Crescent Hotel sometimes mention playing with a boy who lives in the hotel, describing him in ways that match the descriptions of Brecky's ghost. These children seem completely unafraid, treating the encounter as they would any interaction with another child. They describe him as friendly and fun, someone who wanted to play. Their parents, when they hear these accounts, are usually much more disturbed than their children are, especially when details of the description match historical accounts of Brecky's appearance. Adult guests and staff who have encountered Brecky describe the experience as deeply moving and sad. There is something heartbreaking about the idea of a child's spirit trapped in this building, still playing, still bouncing his ball, still looking for playmates, not understanding that he is dead, that more than a century has passed, that the world he knew is long gone. Some people who encounter Brecky report wanting to help him, to somehow communicate with him and explain what has happened, to help him move on to wherever spirits are supposed to go. But how do you explain death to a 4-year-old ghost? How do you help a child spirit who may not even be aware that he needs help? In the basement morgue, where Norman Baker performed his autopsies and kept his grotesque collection of specimens, a different spirit walks. This is the ghost of a nurse, though whether she worked for Baker or was perhaps one of his patients is unclear. She has been seen by multiple people over the years, always doing the same thing, pushing a gurney through the morgue area. The gurney's wheels are said to squeak distinctly, and this sound is often heard even when the ghost herself is not visible. The nurse appears to be middle-aged, wearing a white uniform from the 1930s era, her face set in an expression of grim determination or perhaps sadness. She pushes her gurney through the room, perhaps on an endless loop, perhaps reliving some duty she performed in life, perhaps still trying to care for patients who are long past any earthly help. The morgue is, unsurprisingly, one of the most active areas of the hotel from a paranormal standpoint. Ghost tours always include it as a stop, usually the final one, the climax of the evening's journey through the hotel's dark history. People report feeling overwhelming sadness or dread when they enter the morgue, sometimes to the point of having to leave quickly. Others report feeling suddenly cold, feeling touched by invisible hands, feeling watched by hostile presences. The morgue is where so many of Baker's victims ended up, where their bodies were violated one final time through unnecessary autopsies, where they were reduced to medical specimens in bottles. If any place in the Crescent Hotel should be heavy with negative energy and trapped spirits, it is this room. And then there is Norman Baker himself, the architect of so much suffering, the man whose greed and deception transformed the Crescent Hotel from a place of elegance and education into a house of death. Baker died in Florida in 1958, far from Eureka Springs, far from the scene of his crimes. But his spirit, according to numerous witnesses, has returned to the Crescent Hotel. He is usually seen in the lobby, dressed in his signature costume. White linen suit, lavender shirt, sometimes a white hat. He appears solid and real, not obviously ghostly, which is why some people who see him initially think he is simply another guest or perhaps a staff member in period costume. He usually sits in a chair or stands near the fireplace, watching, observing, his expression unreadable. Unlike the other ghosts at the Crescent, Baker's spirit does not seem lost or confused. He does not seem to be endlessly repeating actions from life. He seems aware, alert, almost as if he is checking on his former domain, making sure his legacy endures. This has led some paranormal investigators to theorize that Baker's spirit is trapped at the Crescent as a kind of punishment, condemned to eternally revisit the scene of his crimes, unable to move on because of the magnitude of the evil he committed. Others suggest that Baker's spirit returns because he is drawn to places where he once held power, where he was important and feared, unable to let go of the control he once wielded. There have been reports of Baker's ghost in other areas of the hotel as well, particularly in the basement morgue where he performed autopsies, but the lobby seems to be his preferred location. Bill Ott, the hotel's director of marketing, has confirmed that Baker's spirit has been spotted numerous times over the years, always appearing the same way, always in his distinctive white and lavender costume, always silent, always vanishing when approached too closely or observed too intently. One particularly chilling account comes from a paranormal investigation led by Jack Moyer and a team from a television show. They were in the morgue, and they asked, as investigators often do, for a sign of any ghostly presence. They asked specifically if Norman Baker was there, if he could make his presence known. According to Moyer's account, they received a response, though what form that response took, he has been careful not to specify in detail, saying only that something happened that convinced even the skeptics in the room that they were not alone, that something was there with them in that cold, dark basement room where so many people had died. Beyond these primary spirits, there are numerous other reported ghosts and paranormal phenomena at the Crescent Hotel. There is Morris, the large orange tabby cat who served as the hotel's unofficial general manager during the 1970s and who was so beloved that more than 80 people attended his burial when he died. Guests still report feeling a cat rubbing against their legs, looking down to pet it, and finding nothing there. There is the young woman from the Crescent College era who fell from the balcony. Her screams are sometimes heard echoing through the stairwell. There are Victorian-era dancers in formal dress who have been seen whirling through the crystal dining room in the early morning hours, dancing to music that no living person can hear. There is a gentleman in Victorian clothing, complete with top hat, who is seen in the lobby and at the bar, always distinguished-looking, always silent, always vanishing before anyone can engage him in conversation. Some have theorized that he might be one of the hotel's original wealthy guests from the 1880s, perhaps someone who loved this place so much that his spirit chose to remain. There are reports of a ghostly waiter carrying a tray of butter through the hallways. Though who he was in life and why butter specifically is part of his haunting remains unknown. There are numerous reports from various rooms throughout the hotel of beds being disturbed in the night, of covers being pulled off sleeping guests, of feelings of being watched, of cold spots that have no rational explanation, of electromagnetic field detector readings that spike without any apparent source. During the 2021 Paranormal Weekend, an annual event that brings together paranormal investigators and enthusiasts, something remarkable was captured on camera in the Crystal Dining Room. An investigator was using a laser grid, a device that projects a grid of laser light across a space so that any solid object passing through will block some of the lights and create a visible shadow or silhouette. The investigator was taking photographs and video of the grid when something appeared to move through it. When the footage was reviewed, it showed what appeared to be a full-body apparition, a human-shaped figure clearly blocking the laser lights, moving across the room. The figure appeared to be sitting on the windowsill, which matched long-standing reports from staff and guests that they often felt someone was sitting there, waiting for someone or something. This photographic evidence, while not definitive proof of the paranormal, was compelling enough to attract significant attention from the ghost hunting community and to be featured in various paranormal documentaries and television programs. The Crescent Hotel has been the subject of investigations by numerous paranormal television shows, including Ghost Hunters, which filmed an episode there that reportedly captured compelling evidence of supernatural activity. Ghost Adventures, another popular paranormal investigation show, also spent time at the Crescent, with the investigators reporting numerous personal experiences and collecting data that they claimed supported the haunting claims. The hotel has also been featured on My Ghost Story, where guests and staff shared their personal paranormal experiences, and on Paranormal Witness, which dramatized some of the more frightening encounters that people have reported at the Crescent. Each of these television appearances brought more attention to the hotel, more guests seeking their own paranormal experiences, more investigators hoping to capture definitive evidence of ghosts. The ghost tours of the Crescent Hotel, which run nightly throughout the year with multiple tours on busy nights and weekends, have become so popular that advance reservations are strongly recommended, especially during October when demand is at its peak. The tours last approximately 90 minutes and take guests through the hotel's history, from its construction and Michael's death through its various incarnations to Norman Baker's cancer hospital and beyond. The tour guides are knowledgeable and engaging, sharing not just the legends, but also the documented historical facts, helping guests understand the context of the hauntings and the real human tragedies that underlie the ghost stories. The tours end in the basement morgue, where guests stand in the same rooms where Norman Baker performed his autopsies, where his victims' bodies were prepared for burial, where specimens were kept in bottles and jars. The guides sometimes conduct brief seances or periods of silence, encouraging guests to open themselves to any spiritual presences, to listen and feel for anything unusual. Many guests report experiencing something during these moments: sudden cold, feelings of being touched, hearing unexplained sounds, seeing shadows move in their peripheral vision. Whether these experiences are genuinely paranormal or products of suggestion and imagination is something each person must decide for themselves. What is undeniable is that something about the Crescent Hotel invites these experiences, encourages these stories, sustains these beliefs. Whether it's because the hotel is genuinely haunted by numerous spirits, or because the combination of its dark history and its atmosphere of Victorian architecture creates a psychological environment where people expect to experience something unusual and therefore interpret ambiguous stimuli as paranormal, or some combination of both. The Crescent Hotel has earned its reputation as one of America's most haunted locations. The investigators and the evidence. The transformation of the Crescent Hotel from a struggling historic property into America's most haunted hotel did not happen by accident. It happened through a combination of genuine paranormal reports, savvy marketing, and serious investigation by people who approached the claims of haunting with varying degrees of skepticism and scientific rigor. The hotel's management, rather than being defensive or dismissive about the ghost stories, embraced them, cooperated with investigators, and created an environment where paranormal research could be conducted seriously. Jack Moyer, the general manager, describes himself as having been a skeptic when he first arrived at the Crescent in 1997. He didn't believe in ghosts. He thought the stories were just folklore, exaggerations, misunderstandings of natural phenomena. But over his years at the hotel, listening to thousands of accounts from guests and staff, experiencing some unexplained phenomena himself, and participating in professional paranormal investigations, his skepticism has softened. He doesn't claim to have all the answers, doesn't insist that he knows with certainty that ghosts exist, but he acknowledges that something strange happens at the Crescent Hotel, something that he cannot fully explain through conventional means. The first major media attention to the Crescent's paranormal claims came with the Ghost Hunters investigation in 2005. Ghost Hunters was, and still is, one of the most popular paranormal investigation shows on television, featuring TAPS, the Atlantic Paranormal Society, a group that approaches claims of haunting with a stated commitment to debunking if possible and only accepting paranormal explanations when all conventional explanations have been eliminated. The TAPS team, led by Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson, brought their equipment to the Crescent Hotel and spent several days investigating the claims, focusing on the most reportedly active locations. The investigation included room 218, where they set up cameras and audio recording equipment, hoping to capture evidence of Michael's activity. They investigated the Crystal Dining Room, the second-floor hallway where Dr. Ellis is often encountered, and most significantly, the basement morgue. During their investigation of the morgue, with Jack Moyer accompanying them, the investigators claimed to capture what they described as a full-body apparition on their thermal imaging camera, a human-shaped heat signature that appeared, moved across the room, and then vanished. This footage was aired as part of their episode about the Crescent Hotel and was considered by many paranormal enthusiasts to be some of the most compelling evidence that the show had ever captured. The Ghost Hunters episode concluded that the Crescent Hotel was genuinely haunted, that there was activity that could not be explained by natural causes, and that multiple entities seemed to be present in the building. This endorsement from a popular and relatively respected paranormal investigation show gave credibility to the Crescent's haunting claims and led to a significant increase in guests seeking paranormal experiences at the hotel. Following the success of the Ghost Hunters investigation, other paranormal television shows sought permission to investigate the Crescent. Ghost Adventures, known for its more confrontational and dramatic approach to ghost hunting, spent time at the hotel for an episode of their show. Host Zach Bagans and his team reported numerous personal experiences during their investigation, including feeling unseen presences touching them, hearing unexplained sounds, and capturing electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, that seemed to be responses to their questions. The Ghost Adventures team tends to be more willing to accept paranormal explanations than the more skeptical ghost hunters, but their investigation still followed certain protocols and involved real investigative equipment. My Ghost Story featured several accounts from guests and staff at the Crescent Hotel who had experienced paranormal activity. This show is different from investigative programs in that it focuses on personal testimonies rather than trying to capture evidence. The accounts shared on My Ghost Story included some of the most detailed and emotional stories of encounters with the Crescent's ghosts. One particularly moving account came from a family who had stayed at the hotel and whose young daughter had played with a boy she described in ways that matched Brecky's appearance. The child was completely unafraid and talked about her new friend as if he were any other child, not understanding why her parents were disturbed by her description. Paranormal Witness dramatized one of the more frightening accounts from the Crescent Hotel, the story of a woman named Summerlyn Scalf who stayed at the hotel in 2004. Summerlyn and her husband Carl, along with another couple, Alice and Ted, had booked a room at the Crescent for Valentine's Day. Summerlyn was pregnant at the time, and she began feeling nauseated and dizzy from the moment she entered the building. During the ghost tour, when the group reached room 218, Summerlyn felt so ill and lightheaded that she nearly fainted. She felt extremely uncomfortable throughout the evening and that night. The truly disturbing part of Summerlyn's account came when she described what happened while she was trying to sleep. She kept dozing off and then waking up feeling strange. She noticed Ted, her friend's husband, walking back and forth to the bathroom repeatedly throughout the night. In the morning, when she mentioned this to Ted, he said he had not gotten out of bed all night. So who or what had Summerlyn seen walking around the room in the darkness? The implication was that Michael's ghost had been moving around the room, and in her half-asleep state, Summerlyn had perceived him as a living person. The group checked out early the next morning, and Summerlyn says she has never wanted to return to the Crescent Hotel. Beyond television investigations, the Crescent Hotel has been studied by numerous independent paranormal research groups. These groups typically use a range of equipment designed to detect various phenomena that are theoretically associated with ghosts and hauntings. Electromagnetic field, EMF, detectors are used to measure fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, which some theories suggest are affected by spiritual presences. Digital voice recorders are used to capture electronic voice phenomena, sounds and voices that are not heard by the human ear during the investigation, but are allegedly recorded by the device. Infrared cameras and night vision equipment allow investigators to see in complete darkness and potentially capture visual evidence of apparitions. Temperature sensors and thermal imaging cameras are used to detect cold spots, which are a commonly reported phenomenon in hauntings, areas where the temperature suddenly drops significantly without any apparent physical cause. Spirit boxes, devices that rapidly scan through radio frequencies creating white noise, are used by some investigators who believe that spirits can manipulate this white noise to form words and communicate. Motion sensors and laser grids can detect movement when no living person is present. And increasingly, sophisticated devices that claim to measure other forms of energy or to convert electromagnetic signals into words are being employed by paranormal investigators. The results of these investigations are, predictably, mixed and controversial. Believers in the paranormal point to the numerous EVPs that have been recorded at the Crescent, voices saying things like "get out," "help me," names that supposedly match known spirits like Michael or Theodora, and responses to specific questions asked by investigators. They point to EMF readings that spike without apparent cause, to photographic anomalies that could be interpreted as apparitions or energy manifestations, to personal experiences of investigators being touched, pushed, or feeling presences that they cannot see. Skeptics, however, note that much of this evidence is ambiguous and open to interpretation. EMF spikes could be caused by electrical wiring in the walls, by mobile phones and other electronic devices, or by numerous other mundane sources. Temperature fluctuations could be due to drafts, to variations in the building's heating system, to windows or doors being open elsewhere in the building affecting airflow. EVPs could be radio interference, sounds from outside the building, or pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive patterns such as words and random noise. Photographic anomalies could be dust, insects, camera strap, lens flares, or artifacts of digital photography. Personal experiences, no matter how sincere, are subjective and difficult to verify. The debate between believers and skeptics about the evidence from the Crescent Hotel investigations mirrors the larger debate about the paranormal in general. No evidence that has been collected at the Crescent or anywhere else has been definitive enough to convince the scientific community that ghosts exist. Paranormal claims remain, in the eyes of mainstream science, extraordinary claims that have not been supported by extraordinary evidence. But for those who have had experiences at the Crescent Hotel, for those who have seen, heard, or felt things they cannot explain, scientific skepticism doesn't diminish the reality of their experiences. The Crescent Hotel now hosts an annual event called the ESP Paranormal Weekend, Eureka Springs Paranormal, which takes place every January. This event brings together paranormal investigators, both professional and amateur, for a weekend of ghost hunting, discussions, presentations, and shared experiences. The 2026 event, the 15th annual, took place on January 23rd and 24th and was fully booked months in advance. Attendees participate in guided paranormal investigations throughout the hotel, with special access to locations that are normally off-limits to guests. It represents the culmination of the Crescent Hotel's transformation from a place where ghost stories were whispered in corridors to a destination that openly embraces its haunted reputation and creates opportunities for people to investigate those claims for themselves. The event includes presentations about the history of the hotel, discussions of various paranormal investigation techniques and theories, and sharing of evidence that attendees have captured during their investigations. For the hotel, The paranormal reputation has been enormously beneficial from a business standpoint. The ghost tours sell out regularly. Rooms in reportedly active areas like 218 and 419 command premium prices and must be booked well in advance. The hotel attracts guests who would never have heard of Eureka Springs otherwise. People drawn specifically by the chance to experience something paranormal. The media attention from television shows and paranormal publications provides free advertising worth far more than any paid campaign could deliver. The Crescent Hotel has successfully built a brand around being America's most haunted hotel, and that brand drives significant revenue. But beyond the business success, there is something more profound at work here. The Crescent Hotel has become a place where people feel comfortable exploring questions about death, the afterlife, and the possibility that consciousness might survive the death of the physical body. These are fundamental human questions, questions that religions and philosophies have grappled with throughout human history, questions that science has largely been unable to answer definitively. The Haunted Hotel provides a framework, an experiential context, where people can engage with these questions in a tangible way. For some guests, a stay at the Crescent Hotel and an encounter with something they interpret as paranormal can be a genuinely spiritual experience, something that challenges their understanding of reality and opens them to possibilities they hadn't seriously considered before. For others, it's entertainment, a thrill, a story to tell friends and family. For still others, it's a disappointment when they experience nothing unusual and leave feeling that the haunting claims are exaggerated or fabricated. All of these responses are valid, and the hotel accommodates them all, never insisting that guests must believe in ghosts, but simply providing the history, the stories, and the opportunity to draw their own conclusions. A place where past and present converge. The Crescent Hotel today operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It is a luxury historic hotel offering fine dining, spa services, elegant accommodations, and beautiful grounds. It is a tourist destination in Eureka Springs, a Victorian town that has itself become a destination for people seeking art galleries, unique shops, and the charm of 19th century American architecture. It is an educational resource, preserving and sharing the history of Eureka Springs, of the Victorian era, of medical fraud, and the human cost of desperation. And it is America's most haunted hotel, a place where the dead supposedly walk among the living, where the past is never truly past. Guests who come to the Crescent Hotel arrive with various motivations and expectations. Some are history buffs who want to stay in a building that has been preserved so well, who want to walk halls that were walked by guests in the 1880s, who want to dine in rooms where Victorian society once gathered. Some are seeking luxury and relaxation, drawn by the spa services, the fine dining, the comfortable rooms, and the spectacular views from the mountaintop location. Some are paranormal enthusiasts who specifically want to experience the hotel's haunted reputation, who book room 218 or 419 in hopes of encountering Michael or Theodora, who participate in the ghost tours and bring their own investigation equipment. The hotel serves all of these constituencies, and it does so remarkably well. The restoration that Marty and Elise Ronick oversaw has created a property that honors its Victorian heritage while providing all the amenities that modern travelers expect. The rooms are beautifully appointed with period furniture, but they also have comfortable modern beds, updated bathrooms, Wi-Fi, and flat-screen televisions discreetly integrated into the historic decor. The public spaces maintain their Victorian elegance while being fully accessible and comfortable for 21st century use. The New Moon Spa on the garden level provides a full range of treatments in a facility that includes hot tubs, saunas, treatment rooms, and relaxation spaces. The dining options at the hotel cater to various tastes and occasions. The 1886 steakhouse in the Crystal Dining Room serves upscale cuisine with an emphasis on steaks and local ingredients, with an award-winning wine list. The chef is accommodating to special dietary requirements, preparing vegetarian and vegan options that are just as carefully crafted as the meat-based dishes. The Sky Bar offers a more casual dining experience with craft cocktails, local beers, and a menu that includes pizza and calzones that have won awards as some of the best in the region. Both venues take advantage of the hotel's stunning location, with windows offering views out over the Ozark Mountains. The grounds of the hotel, 15 acres on the crest of West Mountain, provide numerous opportunities for outdoor relaxation and recreation. Formal gardens with seasonal flowers create colorful displays throughout the warmer months. Nature trails wind through the forested areas of the property, giving guests the chance to experience the natural beauty of the Ozarks without leaving the hotel grounds. Multiple outdoor seating areas and verandas allow guests to sit outside and simply enjoy the fresh mountain air and the spectacular views, which on clear days seem to stretch on forever, ridge after ridge of forested hills fading into blue distance. The treetop cottages, added in 2008, provide an alternative to staying in the main hotel building. These two-bedroom cottages, built in the arts and crafts style that complements the Victorian architecture of the main building, offer privacy and additional space for families or groups traveling together. They are positioned to take advantage of the views and a natural setting, giving guests a sense of being in a treehouse, elevated above the ground with a forest canopy surrounding them. The cottages include full kitchens, living areas, and modern amenities while maintaining the historic aesthetic that characterizes the property. For guests interested in exploring Eureka Springs itself, the hotel is conveniently located just a short drive from the downtown historic district. Eureka Springs is a remarkable town, its entire historic district listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The town clings to steep hillsides in ways that seem to defy logic, with streets that wind up and down and around, never running straight for more than a few dozen yards. There are no traffic lights in Eureka Springs, no chain stores or restaurants, just local businesses and Victorian-era buildings that have been lovingly maintained and adapted for modern use. The town has become known as an artist community, with dozens of galleries showcasing the work of local and regional artists in various media. There are glassblowers, potters, painters, sculptors, jewelers, and craftspeople of all kinds working and selling their creations in Eureka Springs. The town also hosts numerous festivals throughout the year, celebrating everything from local music to vintage cars to the paranormal. The Great Passion Play, an outdoor theatrical production depicting the last week of Christ's life, has been performed in Eureka Springs since 1968, attracting thousands of visitors during its seasonal run. Eureka Springs has also become known as a progressive enclave in conservative Arkansas, being the first town in the state to pass LGBT non-discrimination ordinances and to create a domestic partnership registry. The Metropolitan Community Church of the Living Springs performs commitment ceremonies for same-sex couples, and the town's atmosphere of tolerance and acceptance has drawn a significant gay and lesbian population. This progressive reputation coexists somewhat oddly with the town's other draw as a destination for Christian tourists who come for the Passion Play and to visit Christ of the Ozarks, a large statue of Jesus erected in 1966 on a hill overlooking the town. This contradiction was explored in the 2018 documentary, The Gospel of Eureka, which examined how these seemingly incompatible communities coexist in this small Ozark town. For guests staying at the Crescent Hotel, Eureka Springs offers numerous dining options beyond the hotel's restaurants, ranging from casual cafes to upscale eateries, with an emphasis on locally sourced ingredients and creative preparations. The town's winding streets and steep hills are walkable but challenging, making the hotel's location above the town both a blessing and a potential inconvenience depending on your mobility and energy level. Many guests enjoy walking down the hill into town and then taking a rideshare or taxi back up to the hotel rather than making the steep climb on foot. The springs themselves, the natural phenomena that gave the town its name and its original reason for existence, are still accessible throughout Eureka Springs. Unlike many spa towns where the springs have been diverted or covered over by development, Eureka Springs has maintained many of its springs in accessible locations. Visitors can still taste the water, can still see the springs flowing, though few people still believe in their miraculous healing powers. The springs are now appreciated more as historical and natural features than as medical treatments. The Ozark Water Company, which was founded in Eureka Springs in 1905 to bottle and sell the spring water, still exists, though it is now owned by a multinational corporation and the water is sourced from various locations, not exclusively from Eureka Springs. During the tourist season, which runs from spring through fall with a peak in October, Eureka Springs and the Crescent Hotel can be quite crowded. The town's narrow streets become congested with traffic. Restaurants require reservations. The ghost tours at the hotel sell out weeks in advance. But this bustle is part of the experience, the energy of many people all drawn to this place for various reasons, all sharing the spaces, all contributing their own stories and experiences to the ongoing narrative of Eureka Springs and the Crescent Hotel. In the off-season, particularly January through March, the town becomes much quieter. Many businesses close for the winter or operate on reduced schedules. The landscape, while beautiful in any season, is less obviously so when the trees are bare and the colors are muted. But there is something appealing about Eureka Springs in winter for those who prefer solitude and quiet. The Crescent Hotel offers winter packages that emphasize the spa services and relaxation, recognizing that different guests seek different experiences at different times of year. Throughout the year, the hotel hosts various events beyond the paranormal investigations. Weddings are a significant part of the business, with a Victorian setting providing a romantic backdrop for ceremonies and receptions. The hotel offers several event spaces that can accommodate different sizes of gatherings, from intimate ceremonies for just the couple and a few close family members to large receptions for hundreds of guests. The grounds provide numerous picturesque locations for outdoor ceremonies, weather permitting, and the crystal dining room can be configured for formal seated dinners or more casual cocktail receptions. Corporate events and meetings also make use of the hotel's facilities. There is something about meeting in a historic setting that seems to spark creativity and engagement in ways that modern hotel conference rooms often don't. The Crescent offers meeting spaces with modern audiovisual capabilities, catering services, and the kind of attentive service that makes events run smoothly, all while maintaining the Victorian ambience that makes the setting unique. The staff at the Crescent Hotel are crucial to its success. From housekeeping staff who must clean and maintain Victorian-era spaces to modern standards, to front desk staff who check in guests and answer endless questions about the hotel's history and its ghosts, to kitchen staff who prepare meals in a professional kitchen that must meet contemporary health and safety standards while serving a historic dining room. Everyone who works at the Crescent must balance respect for the building's history with the practical demands of operating a modern business. Many staff members have their own stories of paranormal experiences, having worked in the building during quiet moments when guests are few and strange things sometimes happen. These staff experiences form part of the oral tradition of the hotel, passed along from veteran employees to new hires, reinforcing the haunted reputation and keeping the ghost stories alive and growing. Jack Moyer, who has been with the hotel for nearly 30 years and who witnessed Marty Ronick's vision transform the crumbling building into a premier destination, serves as the institutional memory and guiding force. His dedication to the property and his deep knowledge of its history make him an invaluable resource for guests, for paranormal investigators, for media doing stories about the hotel, and for the staff who look to him for leadership and guidance. Moyer's journey from skeptic to someone who acknowledges that something unexplainable happens at the Crescent Hotel mirrors the journey that many guests experience during their stays, starting with doubt and ending with a willingness to consider possibilities they might have dismissed before. As the sun sets over the Ozark Mountains, casting long shadows across Eureka Springs and bathing the Crescent Hotel in golden light that makes its limestone walls glow as if lit from within, as guests gather on the verandas to watch the sunset and sip their drinks, as the ghost tour groups begin to assemble in the lobby, flashlights in hand and excitement in their eyes, the hotel exists in a kind of timeless space. The Victorian guests who danced in the Crystal Dining Room in 1886, the young women who studied at the Crescent College in 1915, Norman Baker's desperate patients who sought healing in 1938, the guests who stayed in 1990 or 2005 or last week, they are all part of the continuing story of this place. The past is not dead here. It is not even past, to borrow William Faulkner's famous phrase. It is alive, present, walking the halls, making itself known to those who are willing to look and listen. And perhaps that is the real secret of the Crescent Hotel, the reason it has succeeded where so many historic properties have failed, the reason it draws visitors from around the world. It has found a way to make history tangible, to make the past accessible, to blur the boundary between then and now in ways that are both entertaining and profound. Whether the ghosts are real in any objective sense may be less important than the fact that people experience something at the Crescent Hotel, something that makes them think about death and memory and the persistence of the past, something that stays with them long after they've checked out and driven down the winding mountain road away from Eureka Springs. The Crescent Hotel stands as a monument not just to Victorian architecture, but to resilience, to the human capacity to survive tragedy and find new purposes, to the power of stories to preserve memory across generations. It has been a resort, a school, a hospital of horrors, an abandoned ruin, and now a thriving business that honors all of its past while serving the needs of the present. It is a place where the doctor never left, where Norman Baker walks the lobby in his white suit, where Michael still flirts with pretty women, where Theodora still searches for her key, where little Brecky still bounces his ball, where the past refuses. And so we come to the end of our journey through the strange and haunted history of the Crescent Hotel, though in truth, this story has no ending. As long as the building stands on its mountaintop, as long as guests walk its hallways and sleep in its rooms, as long as the spirits continue to make their presence known, the story continues. We have traveled from the healing springs that drew thousands to Eureka Springs in the 1880s, through the construction of the Grand Hotel and the tragic death of young Michael the Stonemason, through decades as a resort destination for society's elite, through the years as a school for young women, through the dark period when Norman Baker transformed the building into a house of death masquerading as a hospital, through years of decline and abandonment, and finally to the restoration and rebirth that has made the Crescent Hotel one of the most unique destinations in America. The spirits who walk these halls are not just ghost stories told to frighten tourists or sell hotel rooms. They represent real people who lived, who suffered, who died, whose lives were cut short by accident or disease or fraud. Michael was a real young man who fell to his death during construction. Brecky was a real child who died of appendicitis far too young. Theodora and the other patients at Baker's Cancer Hospital were real people who came seeking healing and found only false hope and death. Dr. Ellis was a real physician who served the hotel's guests. Even Norman Baker, monster that he was a real person whose actions had real consequences for dozens of people and their families. These ghosts, if they exist, are the echoes of real human tragedies, and they deserve to be remembered not just as spooky stories, but as people who mattered, whose lives meant something, whose deaths should not be forgotten. The question of whether ghosts really exist, whether the paranormal phenomena reported at the Crescent Hotel represent genuine interaction with spirits of the dead or are better explained by psychology, suggestion, and misinterpretation of natural phenomena, is ultimately less important than what the haunting represents. The Crescent Hotel has become a place where people confront questions about death and what might lie beyond it, where the barrier between the living and the dead seems thinner than usual, where the past feels tangibly present in ways that most places do not allow. Whether this is because spirits genuinely haunt the building, or because the combination of its dark history and its Victorian atmosphere creates a powerful psychological environment where people's imaginations and expectations shape their perceptions is, in the end, something each visitor must decide for themselves. What is undeniable is that the Crescent Hotel matters. It matters as an example of Victorian architecture preserved and restored when so many similar buildings have been lost. It matters as a piece of Arkansas history, a monument to the boom and bust cycle of Eureka Springs, to the hopes and dreams that built this town and this hotel, to the tragedies that occurred within these walls. It matters as a successful example of adaptive reuse, of finding new purposes for historic buildings that keep them viable and useful rather than leaving them to decay or demolishing them to make way for something new. It matters as a place where history is not locked away in museums or textbooks, but is accessible, experiential, where visitors can touch the same stones that Irish stonemasons placed in the 1880s, can walk the same halls that Norman Baker's patients walked in their final days, can sleep in rooms where countless people before them have slept, dreamed, hoped, feared, and sometimes died. The hotel also matters as an economic engine for Eureka Springs. In a small town that struggles to maintain its population and its economy, the Crescent Hotel provides year-round employment for dozens of people, generates revenue for local businesses through the tourists it attracts, and helps maintain Eureka Springs' reputation as a destination worth visiting. Without the Crescent and other historic properties that have been preserved and repurposed, Eureka Springs might have faded into obscurity, another small Ozark town with an interesting past, but no viable future. Instead, it thrives, at least by the standards of small rural towns in the 21st century, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors each year who spend their money in local businesses and contribute to the community's economic health. But perhaps most importantly, the Crescent Hotel matters because of what it teaches us about memory, about the importance of remembering the past with all its complexity, beauty, and horror. It would have been easy for the hotel to simply erase the Norman Baker period from its history, to focus only on the Victorian elegance and ignore the decades when it was a fraudulent cancer hospital. Many historic properties do exactly that, highlighting only the positive aspects of their past and glossing over or outright hiding the darker chapters. The Crescent Hotel has chosen a different path, embracing the entirety of its history, acknowledging that Norman Baker's crimes occurred within these walls, preserving the morgue where his victims ended up, sharing those stories with visitors not to glorify the horror, but to ensure that the victims are not forgotten, that their suffering is acknowledged, that the crimes committed against them are remembered as a warning about what can happen when desperation meets deception. This honest engagement with history, including the difficult and uncomfortable parts, is something that our society needs more of. We tend to prefer sanitized versions of the past, stories where the good guys are clearly good and the bad guys are clearly bad, where everything resolves neatly and lessons are clear and simple. But real history is messier than that, more complicated, more ambiguous. Real history includes moments of great beauty and nobility alongside moments of tremendous cruelty and selfishness, often involving the same people and the same places. The Crescent Hotel, by preserving and sharing its entire history, teaches us that we can acknowledge the bad without erasing the good, that we can remember the victims without forgetting the moments of joy and elegance that also occurred within these walls, that places and people are complex and cannot be reduced to simple categories of good or evil, haunted or not haunted, worth preserving or worth forgetting. As you lie in your bed tonight, perhaps drifting towards sleep, perhaps listening to this story in the darkness, think about the Crescent Hotel perched on its mountaintop in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. Picture its limestone walls glowing pale in the moonlight, its many windows dark except for a few where guests are still awake, its towers and turrets reaching up toward the stars. Imagine the guests sleeping in those rooms, some of them hoping to encounter a ghost, others hoping desperately not to, all of them unknowingly sharing space with the spirits who never left, who cannot leave, who are tied to this place by trauma or duty or love or reasons that we cannot fully understand. Imagine Michael in room 218, still playing his pranks, still hoping to catch the eye of a pretty woman. Imagine Theodora outside room 419, still searching for her key, still trying to find her way home. Imagine little Brecky bouncing his ball down the hallway, still playing, still exploring, still waiting for someone to play with him. Imagine Dr. Ellis making his eternal rounds, still caring for the guests, still fulfilling his duty even in death. Imagine Norman Baker in the lobby, dressed in his white suit and lavender shirt, watching, observing, perhaps beginning to understand the magnitude of what he did, perhaps still too narcissistic to care. And imagine yourself there, walking those hallways, perhaps on a ghost tour, flashlight in hand, heart beating faster as you descend the stairs to the basement morgue, knowing what happened in that cold stone room, knowing that some people believe the spirits of the victims still linger there, still suffering, still waiting. How would you feel? Would you be excited, thrilled by the possibility of encountering something supernatural? Would you be frightened, regretting your decision to take the tour, wanting only to get back to your room and lock the door? Would you be skeptical, analyzing every sound and shadow, looking for the rational explanation, the natural cause for what others interpret as paranormal? Or would you be open, receptive, willing to experience whatever might happen without preconceptions or expectations, willing to be surprised? The Crescent Hotel offers all of us, whether we ever visit in person or only hear about it in stories like this one, an opportunity to consider these questions, to think about death and memory and the persistence of the past, to wonder whether consciousness survives the death of the body, whether the dead can communicate with the living, whether places can hold memories in their stones and timbers, whether history is really past or whether it continues to exist alongside the present. Overlapping, intersecting, occasionally breaking through into our awareness in ways that we interpret as hauntings or ghosts or paranormal phenomena. There are no easy answers to these questions. Science remains skeptical of claims of the paranormal, and rightly so, given the lack of conclusive, repeatable, verifiable evidence. But science also cannot definitively prove that ghosts do not exist, cannot fully explain every reported paranormal experience through conventional means, cannot eliminate the possibility that there are aspects of reality, of consciousness, of the relationship between mind and matter that we do not yet understand, and that might account for at least some of the phenomena that people interpret as supernatural. The Crescent Hotel exists in this space of uncertainty, this gap between the known and the unknown, the explained and the unexplainable, and it invites us to be comfortable with not having all the answers, to accept mystery as part of the human experience, to find wonder in the questions themselves rather than insisting on certainties that might not be available. And with that, dear listeners, we reach the end of our tale, though, as I said, this story truly has no ending. The Crescent Hotel stands tonight as it has stood for nearly 140 years, and as it will likely stand for many years to come. The spirits walk its halls tonight as they have walked them for decades, perhaps for more than a century. The guests sleep in its rooms tonight, some peacefully, some less so. The history continues to unfold, adding new chapters, new experiences, new stories to the already rich lore of this remarkable place. And somewhere on that mountaintop, in that grand Victorian building with its dark secrets and its elegant beauty, Norman Baker walks the lobby in his white suit, the doctor who never left, forever tied to the place where he committed his crimes, forever remembered not for the good he could have done, but for the evil he chose to commit. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of the Crescent Hotel. I hope this story has given you something to think about, perhaps something to dream about, as you drift off to sleep. Sleep well knowing that your past, whatever it was, is in the past, and that spirits are wandering in different corridors, pursuing different goals, disturbing different lives, far from your bed. Before we part ways for tonight, I would like to ask for your support of Mystic Sleep Tales. If you enjoyed this story, found it engaging or thought-provoking, or helped you fall asleep, please subscribe to our channel. Click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll be notified when we post a new request. Your subscription helps us continue to create these long-running, in-depth explorations of mystical and historical subjects. Leave a comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is. Tell us if you've ever visited the Crescent Hotel or Eureka Springs. If you've had your own paranormal experiences, if you believe in ghosts or are a skeptic, let us know what other mysteries and historical topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes. Your comments and suggestions help us determine the direction of this channel and ensure we create content that resonates with you. And if there are specific stories you'd like to hear, particular haunted places, or historical mysteries that fascinate you, please share those suggestions with us in the comments. We read every comment and take your suggestions seriously. This channel exists thanks to listeners like you, and your engagement with the content through subscriptions, comments, likes, and shares makes it possible for us to continue producing these detailed, researched, atmospheric mysteries and unexplained stories. The world is full of places like the Crescent Hotel, where history has left deep marks, tragedy and triumph coexist, the past refuses to be buried, and stories refuse to be forgotten. We want to explore these places with you, share their histories, examine the supernatural claims that often surround them, and allow you to draw your own conclusions between the real and the imagined, the haunted and the purely atmospheric. Therefore, please join us on this journey through the mysteries hidden in the shadows of history, in ancient buildings and forgotten places, in stories worthy of being told and remembered. From all of us at Mystic Sleep Tales, good night, good sleep, and sweet dreams. May the spirits leave you in peace, and may the morning find you rested and refreshed, ready to face the mysteries the waking world may hold. Until next time, I bid you farewell as your host, and remind you that history is never as simple as it seems, that the line between the living and the dead can be thinner than we think, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the doctor never leaves. Remember, tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.